What if you could make almost anyone agree with you without them realizing why? These aren't stage tricks or magic words. They're real psychological tactics, subtle, invisible, and devastatingly effective. Used in negotiations, relationships, and everyday conversations, they work not because people are weak, but because human minds all follow predictable patterns. In the next 3 hours, you'll learn 50 of these techniques, dark strategies that can tilt decisions, bend emotions, and close deals before the other person knows what happened. And we'll begin with one of the most dangerous because of how natural it feels. The assumption close. Picture this. You're at a car dealership. You've been looking, asking questions, weighing options. The salesperson has been patient, helpful, friendly. Then, without warning, they hand you a pen and slide a contract across the table. If you could just sign here, they say, as if the decision has already been made. We'll get the paperwork started. Your mind freezes. When did you decide to buy? You don't remember agreeing to anything. But there's the contract, there's the pen, and suddenly saying no feels like backing out of something you've already committed to. This is the assumption close, acting as if agreement has already been reached when it hasn't. It works because our minds hate disrupting what appears to be a natural flow of events. We're social creatures, wired to avoid the awkwardness of contradiction. When someone treats our compliance as inevitable, part of us begins to believe it is. You can see it everywhere once you know what to look for. In job interviews where the interviewer asks, "When can you start?" before offering the position. In relationships where one person begins making plans that assume the other's participation. In meetings where decisions are presented as conclusions already reached. The technique doesn't announce itself. It slips into conversations like a shadow. When we implement this, instead of if we implement this. After you start using this, not if you decide to try this, the future becomes assumed, inevitable, already written. The power lies in its subtlety. Crude manipulation announces itself, triggers resistance. But the assumption close feels natural, like a river finding its way to the sea. By the time you realize what happened, you're already downstream. Yet beneath this smooth technique lies something deeper, something that shapes not just what we agree to, but how we perceive the very range of possibilities before us. And that begins with understanding how our minds anchor to the first thing they encounter. Anchoring bias exploitation. A number appears in your mind, $500. Now imagine I'm selling you a watch. Before I tell you anything about it, its features, its quality, its brand, I mention that similar watches retail for $2,000. Suddenly, $500 doesn't seem so expensive anymore, does it? You've just experienced anchoring, one of the most powerful cognitive biases in human psychology. The first piece of information we encounter doesn't just inform our decision, it warps our entire perception of what's reasonable, what's fair, what's possible. Real estate agents know this intimately. They don't start by showing you the house in your budget. They start with something magnificent and expensive, something that makes your actual target seem modest by comparison. Your brain, having seen what $800,000 buys, suddenly finds $400,000 reasonable. The anchor has been set, and every subsequent judgment drifts toward it like iron filings to a magnet. But the truly elegant exploitation goes beyond simple price manipulation. Master practitioners plant anchors in conversations, in assumptions, in the very framing of problems. A negotiator doesn't ask, "How much can you offer?" They ask, "I was hoping for something around $50,000. What are your thoughts?" The number hangs in the air, creating a gravitational pull that draws all subsequent offers toward it. The technique works because our brains are fundamentally lazy. Processing information from scratch requires enormous energy. So we take shortcuts, using the first relevant information we encounter as a starting point, then adjusting from there. But the adjustments are always insufficient. We never move far enough away from that initial anchor. This isn't just about money. Anchoring shapes how we perceive time. This usually takes 6 months, but maybe we can do it in 4. It shapes how we perceive quality. Most people struggle with this, but you seem smarter than average, and even our own capabilities. This is quite advanced, but I think you might be able to handle it. The most insidious part is how natural it feels. The anchor doesn't announce itself as manipulation. It arrives disguised as helpful context, as relevant background information. By the time you realize its influence, your judgment has already been quietly, thoroughly reshaped. But sometimes the manipulation becomes even more sophisticated, presenting choices that aren't really choices at all. The Decoy Effect. 3 movie theater popcorn sizes sit before you. Small for $3, medium for $6.50, and large for $7. Which do you choose? If you're like most people, you choose the large. Not because you necessarily want that much popcorn, but because compared to the medium, it seems like an incredible deal. You're getting almost twice as much for just 50 cents more. The medium looks absurd, overpriced, almost insulting. But here's what you don't see. The medium isn't there to be sold. It's there to make you buy the large. This is the decoy effect, also known as asymmetric dominance. The medium popcorn is an inferior decoy designed to make the large option look irresistibly attractive. Remove the medium, and suddenly many people would choose the small. Add the ridiculously overpriced medium back in, and the large becomes the smart choice. You can see this everywhere once you understand the pattern. Magazine subscriptions that offer print only for $125, online only for $59, or both print and online for $125. Nobody chooses print only. That's not the point. Its presence makes the combined option feel like you're getting online access for free. Dating apps use this too. They show you profiles in strategic sequences, an extremely attractive but clearly unavailable person, followed by someone merely very attractive but seemingly more attainable. The second person looks better by comparison, more within reach. The impossible option makes the merely difficult seem reasonable. The decoy doesn't have to be obviously inferior. Sometimes it's designed to be almost as good as your preferred option, but missing one key element, a laptop that's nearly identical to the premium model, but lacks the one feature you care most about. A vacation package that includes almost everything you want, but excludes the one experience that drew you to the destination. Master practitioners layer multiple decoys, creating a landscape of choices where every path leads to their preferred destination. They understand that we don't evaluate options in isolation. We compare, we contrast, we look for the best deal among what's presented. Control the comparison set, and you control the decision. The elegance lies in how it harnesses our rationality against us. We feel smart, analytical, careful. We're choosing the best option available. We just don't realize that the available options have been carefully curated to make one choice inevitable. And when that choice needs to be made quickly, when time itself becomes a weapon, the psychology becomes even more potent. Scarcity manufacturing. This is manufactured scarcity, the artificial creation of limitation to trigger our most primitive psychological responses. It works because scarcity is hardwired into our survival programming. For most of human history, missing out on a limited resource could mean the difference between life and death. That urgency hasn't left us. It's simply been repurposed. The countdown timer appears on your screen. 23 hours, 47 minutes, 12 seconds remaining. Below it, text that makes your heart rate spike. Only 3 left in stock. You weren't planning to buy anything when you opened your laptop. Now you're reaching for your credit card. The psychology operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the fear of missing out. Yes, but also something deeper, the human need to feel special, chosen, part of an exclusive group. When something is scarce, possessing it becomes a mark of distinction. We don't just want the thing, we want to be the kind of person who can obtain the thing. Watch how this plays out in job markets. The most successful candidates aren't necessarily the most qualified. They're the ones who create the impression that their time and attention are limited resources. They mention other opportunities, other companies courting them. They seem always on the verge of being unavailable. Suddenly, hiring managers who were casually interested become urgently committed. But true masters of this technique don't rely on obvious countdown timers and stock alerts. They create scarcity in subtler, more powerful ways. They limit access to themselves. I only take on 3 clients per month. They create exclusive information. I probably shouldn't be telling you this. They manufacture social scarcity. Most people aren't ready for this conversation. The beauty of manufactured scarcity is how it transforms desire into need, consideration into urgency. It doesn't create want, it converts existing want into must-have now. And in that transformation, rational decision-making often gets left behind. The technique extends beyond material scarcity into emotional and temporal realms. I don't usually open up to people this quickly. We don't typically make exceptions, but in your case, the scarcity isn't about objects. It's about access, about breaking normal rules, about being given something that others are denied. Even more sophisticated practitioners create scarcity around problems themselves. They don't just offer solutions, they reveal that the problem is more urgent, more limited in its window for resolution than you realized. Most people don't notice this until it's too late. There's usually only a small window when this can be addressed effectively. But even without artificial time pressure, our minds can be nudged towards specific conclusions through the careful cultivation of invisible consensus. Social proof fabrication. You walk into a restaurant. It's nearly empty, but as you approach the host, you notice a small sign, as seen on TV with logos from Food Network and Travel Channel. On the walls, framed reviews from food bloggers you've never heard of, but whose names sound authoritative. The host mentions that they're booked solid most nights. You just got lucky with a cancellation. None of this might be true. The TV appearances might have been brief mentions. The reviews might be from obscure blogs with tiny readerships. The booking situation might be completely fabricated, but it doesn't matter. Your brain has already processed the social signals and reached its conclusion. Other people like this place, therefore you should too. This is social proof fabrication, the artificial creation of consensus to influence behavior. It exploits one of our most fundamental psychological shortcuts. When we're uncertain, we look to others for guidance, but the others we're looking to might be carefully constructed illusions. The technique has evolved far beyond fake Yelp reviews, though those remain disturbingly common. Modern practitioners understand that social proof is about more than just numbers. It's about the right kinds of people providing validation. A single testimonial from someone who resembles the target audience can be worth more than dozens of generic positive reviews. Watch how this manifests in professional settings. A consultant doesn't just claim expertise. They mention clients by name when allowed, reference conferences where they've spoken, cite statistics about their success rate. They create the impression of a community of satisfied customers, of recognition by peers, of being in demand. The social proof is layered, subtle, and devastatingly effective. Digital platforms have made this both easier and more sophisticated. Bot networks can create the appearance of viral popularity. Carefully managed social media accounts can suggest bustling communities around brands or ideas. The line between genuine social proof and manufactured consensus has become increasingly blurred. But the most elegant practitioners don't fabricate proof. They curate it. They understand that real social proof exists everywhere. It just needs to be selectively highlighted. They feature testimonials from their most satisfied customers while letting dissatisfied voices fade into silence. They emphasize metrics that look impressive while downplaying less favorable ones. The psychology works because social proof serves an important function in genuine decision-making. In a world of infinite choices and limited information, seeing what others have chosen helps us navigate complexity. The problem arises when that helpful shortcut is exploited by those who understand how to manufacture the signals we rely on. And once we've accepted the validity of those signals, our minds become vulnerable to a more direct form of psychological pressure. The door-in-the-face technique. A college student approaches you on the street. "Excuse me," they say politely. "I'm working with a local charity. Would you be willing to volunteer 2 hours every week for the next 6 months to help underprivileged children?" You immediately shake your head. "That's a huge commitment." "I understand," they respond. "That is a lot to ask. Would you at least be willing to donate $5 to help these children?" $5 suddenly seems very reasonable. In fact, it seems almost selfish to refuse such a small request after declining the larger one. You reach for your wallet. You've just experienced the door-in-the-face technique, the strategic presentation of an extreme request followed by a more moderate one. The first request was never meant to be accepted. It was meant to make the second request seem small, reasonable, almost generous in its modesty. The psychology operates on the principle of reciprocal concessions. When someone appears to compromise by reducing their request, we feel obligated to reciprocate by becoming more agreeable. They've given ground, so fairness demands that we do the same. The fact that their concession was planned from the beginning doesn't diminish its psychological impact. Master negotiators use this technique with surgical precision. They don't just make outrageous opening offers, they craft extreme requests that highlight specific aspects of what they really want. A software consultant might first propose a comprehensive system overhaul requiring 6 months and a massive budget. When the client balks, they suggest a focused solution targeting just the most critical issues, exactly what they intended to propose all along. The technique works because it reframes the entire interaction. Instead of evaluating the second request on its own merits, we evaluate it in comparison to the first. Our reference point has been shifted. What might have seemed expensive or time-consuming now appears modest and manageable. But the true artistry lies in making the initial extreme request seem genuine, not ridiculous. It must be outside the realm of what's acceptable, while remaining within the realm of what's conceivable. Too extreme, and the technique backfires. People see through the manipulation. Too modest, and it doesn't create enough contrast to make the real request seem attractive. The most sophisticated practitioners embed this technique so naturally into conversation that the two-step process becomes invisible. They mention ambitious possibilities in passing, gauge the reaction, then naturally settle on more modest goals. The extreme request doesn't feel like a request at all. It feels like brainstorming, like thinking out loud, like exploring possibilities. And when that psychological door closes in our face, our minds automatically search for ways to be helpful, to find a middle ground. We become collaborators in our own persuasion. Yet sometimes the most powerful influence works in the opposite direction, beginning with the smallest possible commitment and gradually expanding from there. Foot in the door escalation. A neighbor knocks on your door. Could you possibly put a small sign in your window supporting safe driving? It's tiny, barely noticeable, for a good cause. Of course you agree. 2 weeks later, they're back. The campaign has been so successful, they wonder if you'd be willing to put a larger sign in your yard. You already supported the cause once. It would seem inconsistent to refuse now. You say yes. A month later, they ask if you'd volunteer to canvass the neighborhood. After all, you've already shown your commitment. This is the foot-in-the-door technique, beginning with a small, almost trivial request and gradually escalating to larger commitments. It works because of our deep psychological need for consistency. Once we've defined ourselves as someone who supports safe driving or any cause, we feel compelled to act in ways that align with that identity. The power lies not in the individual requests, but in the identity shift that occurs between them. The first small agreement doesn't just secure compliance, it changes how we see ourselves. We become someone who cares about this issue, someone who helps their community, someone who acts on their values. Future requests tap into this newly crystallized identity. Skilled practitioners understand that the initial request must be genuinely small and seemingly reasonable. It can't feel like the first step in a manipulation. It must feel like a natural, isolated ask that any reasonable person would fulfill. The true art is in reading the psychological moment when identity has shifted enough to support a larger request. This technique operates powerfully in digital environments. Apps don't ask for full access to your contacts, location, and camera all at once. They start with a simple notification permission, then location just for a better experience, then contacts to help you find friends. Each small concession feels reasonable in isolation, but together they create comprehensive data access that users would have rejected if requested upfront. The escalation doesn't have to be immediate. The most effective implementation space requests over time, allowing the identity shift to solidify between asks. A political campaign might start by asking supporters to sign a petition, then later request a small donation, then volunteer time, then host an event. Each step builds on the identity established by the previous commitment. But the technique reveals something profound about human psychology. We don't just act based on our beliefs shift to align with our actions. The person who puts up the small sign doesn't just support safe driving, they become someone who supports safe driving. And that new identity, once formed, seeks opportunities for expression. The most elegant practitioners never reveal the full scope of what they're seeking. They genuinely focus on each individual request, allowing the natural psychology of consistency to drive the escalation. The pressure doesn't come from them, it comes from the person's own need to remain coherent to themselves. And sometimes, that need for coherence can be activated through the surprising psychological power of asking for small favors. The Benjamin Franklin Effect. Benjamin Franklin had a problem. A fellow legislator disliked him, actively opposed his proposals, and seemed determined to undermine his political influence. Franklin could have confronted him, argued with him, or tried to win him over with charm. Instead, he did something that seemed counterintuitive. He asked his enemy for a favor. Franklin knew the man owned a rare book. He sent a courteous note, asking if he might borrow it for a few days. The man, perhaps flattered by the recognition of his literary taste, agreed. When Franklin returned the book with a gracious thank you note, something had shifted. His enemy wasn't quite so hostile anymore. In fact, they began to develop a genuine friendship. This is the Benjamin Franklin effect, the psychological phenomenon where someone who does you a favor becomes more likely to help you again, and more importantly, more likely to like you. It seems backwards, but our minds work in mysterious ways to maintain consistency between our actions and our feelings. When someone does you a favor, their brain faces a small psychological problem. Why did I help this person? The easiest answer is that you must be worth helping, that you must be likable, that there must be something positive about you. Rather than admitting they acted for trivial reasons or made a mistake, their mind adjusts their opinion of you to match their behavior. The technique works because cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding contradictory thoughts, pushes us toward consistency. If I helped you, I must like you, because I don't help people I dislike. This small mental adjustment creates a foundation for future cooperation and positive feelings. Master practitioners of this technique understand that the favor should play to the person's strengths or interests. Ask a photographer to recommend a camera. Ask a reader to suggest a book. Ask someone proud of their garden for advice on plants. The favor becomes an opportunity for them to demonstrate knowledge or skill, making the interaction inherently rewarding. But the favor must be chosen carefully. It should be meaningful enough to create psychological investment, but not so large as to feel burdensome or manipulative. The perfect ask involves something the person can do easily, but takes a small amount of time or thought, sharing expertise, providing a recommendation, offering an opinion on something they care about. The timing matters too. The request should come when the relationship is neutral, not hostile. It works best when there's no obvious reason for the person to help. The surprise of their own generosity creates stronger psychological impact than predictable assistance. The beauty of the Benjamin Franklin effect is that it creates genuine positive feelings, not just compliance. Unlike pure manipulation, it often results in authentic improvements in the relationship. Both parties can benefit. One gets help, the other gets to feel generous and useful. But sometimes the cultivation of positive feelings requires a more direct investment, the creation of a sense of obligation that extends beyond any single interaction. Reciprocity debt creation. A real estate agent shows up to your home evaluation with a folder of market analysis, a professional photographer to take listing photos, and a small gift, a bottle of wine from a local vineyard with a note about supporting neighborhood businesses. I always like to get started on the marketing materials, she explains, so we can move quickly when you're ready. You haven't signed anything. You haven't committed to working with her. But suddenly, you feel like you owe her something. This is reciprocity debt creation, the strategic giving of unsolicited value to create psychological obligation. It exploits one of the most fundamental rules of human social interaction. When someone gives us something, we feel compelled to give something back. The debt doesn't require a contract or explicit agreement. It exists purely in the realm of social psychology, but it's no less powerful for being invisible. The technique works because reciprocity is hardwired into human cooperation. Throughout our evolutionary history, those who could create and maintain reciprocal relationships survived and thrived. Those who couldn't were excluded from the group. The feeling of being indebted to someone who helped us isn't just social courtesy, it's a survival mechanism that kept our ancestors alive. Watch how this plays out in business development. A consulting firm doesn't just send a proposal, they send a detailed analysis of the prospect's industry, complete with actionable insights. A software company doesn't just offer a demo, they provide a customized report showing exactly how their solution would integrate with the prospect's current systems. Value is given freely before any commitment is requested. But master practitioners understand the subtleties that make this technique devastatingly effective. The gift or favor must feel genuine, not transactional. It should arrive before any request for reciprocation. It should be valuable enough to create real appreciation, but not so valuable as to seem like an obvious bribe. And crucially, it should be difficult to return directly. The psychological debt becomes even more powerful when the gift is personalized, showing that thought and effort went into its creation. A salesperson who remembers your interest from a previous conversation and brings relevant articles or resources creates much stronger reciprocity pressure than one who offers generic promotional items. The timing of the eventual ask matters enormously. Request something too soon, and the reciprocity feels transactional, manipulative. Wait too long, and the psychological debt begins to fade. Master practitioners develop an intuitive sense for the moment when gratitude is strongest and most likely to convert into cooperation. But perhaps the most sophisticated application involves creating reciprocity debt, not through gifts, but through vulnerability, sharing something personal or confidential that makes the recipient feel trusted and special. This creates an even deeper obligation, one that extends beyond simple fairness into the realm of honor and relationship. And when reciprocity combines with the psychological weight of authority, the influence becomes almost irresistible. Authority positioning. Two identical emails land in your inbox. Both contain the same investment advice, word for word. One is signed John Smith. The other is signed Dr. John Smith, Ph.D. in economics, former Goldman Sachs analyst, author of Market Mastery. Which one do you trust? Which advice do you follow? The content is identical, but your response is completely different. This is authority positioning, the strategic establishment of credibility to increase influence. It works because our brains use shortcuts to evaluate trustworthiness. In a world of infinite information and limited time, we rely on external markers of expertise rather than evaluating every claim independently. But true authority positioning goes far beyond listing credentials. Master practitioners understand that authority must be demonstrated, not declared. They don't announce their expertise. They reveal it through casual references, through the quality of their questions, through their ability to predict and explain complex patterns that others miss. Watch how this unfolds in professional settings. A true expert doesn't lead with their resume. They ask questions that reveal deep understanding of the industry, reference solutions they've implemented in similar situations, and demonstrate familiarity with challenges that only someone with real experience would know. Their authority emerges organically from the conversation itself. The psychology operates on multiple levels. There's the conscious evaluation of credentials, yes, but also something deeper, the unconscious recognition of mastery. When someone speaks with genuine expertise, others sense it in ways they can't always articulate. The choice of words, the confidence in predictions, the ability to simplify complex concepts without losing nuance, these all signal authentic authority. Positioning becomes especially powerful when it's validated by third parties. An expert who mentions speaking at conferences or being quoted in publications isn't just claiming authority, they're demonstrating that others recognize their expertise. This social proof amplifies the credibility signal exponentially. But the most sophisticated authority positioning involves emotional intelligence alongside technical expertise. True influencers don't just know their subject, they understand how to communicate their knowledge in ways that make others feel informed rather than intimidated, included rather than excluded. The danger lies in how automatically we respond to authority signals. Our brains process these cues so quickly that we often defer to expertise before critically evaluating whether that expertise is relevant to the current situation. A brilliant surgeon's opinion on economic policy carries weight it shouldn't, simply because our minds conflate different types of authority. Yet even the most carefully constructed authority can be undermined if it's wielded without understanding the subtle ways emotion spreads from one mind to another. Emotional contagion control. You enter a meeting room where everyone is tense. You can feel it immediately, the tight shoulders, the careful words, the energy that seems to vibrate with unspoken conflict. Within minutes, your own mood has shifted. Your jaw clenches. Your thoughts become more defensive. You didn't decide to feel this way. The emotion simply transferred from the group into your consciousness like a virus. This is emotional contagion, the automatic, unconscious mimicking of emotional states between humans. It happens through micro-expressions, body language, tone of voice, and even the subtle rhythms of breathing. We're wired to sync emotionally with those around us, an evolutionary adaptation that helped our ancestors coordinate group responses to threats and opportunities. Master practitioners of influence understand this phenomenon intimately. They don't just manage their words, they manage their emotional broadcast. They enter interactions in carefully calibrated emotional states, knowing that others will unconsciously mirror what they project. Want to create urgency? Arrive with controlled excitement. Need to establish trust? Project calm confidence. Seeking to inspire action. Radiate determined energy. But the true artistry lies in emotional layering. Skilled manipulators don't project simple, single emotions. They create rich, emotional cocktails that serve their purposes. They might speak with concern, making you feel that your struggles are understood. At the same time, they add a note of optimism, hinting that solutions are within reach. And then just beneath it all, they weave in urgency, making it seem as though action must be taken right away. The person on the receiving end absorbs this blend without ever realizing why they're suddenly swept up in the same storm of feelings. The technique becomes even more powerful when the emotional state seems to emerge naturally from the situation rather than being imposed by one person. A negotiator might structure a meeting to naturally create time pressure, competitive tension, or collaborative excitement. The emotions feel authentic because they arise from the circumstances, even though those circumstances have been carefully orchestrated. Watch how this operates in sales environments. The most successful salespeople don't just describe products, they embody the emotional experience of owning them. Their excitement about a car's performance is contagious. Their satisfaction with a software solution spreads to prospects. Their confidence in an investment strategy transfers to potential clients. They become emotional tuning forks, setting the frequency for the entire interaction. Digital communication has made emotional contagion both more challenging and more important. Without physical presence, influencers must rely on word choice, timing, and narrative structure to create emotional resonance. A carefully crafted email can generate excitement or anxiety just as effectively as face-to-face interaction, but it requires more sophisticated understanding of how emotions translate through text. The phenomenon reveals something profound about human consciousness. We're not as individually contained as we imagine. Our emotions, thoughts, and even decisions exist in constant dialogue with those around us. The boundaries between one mind and another are far more porous than most people realize. And when emotions begin to shift in the desired direction, the stage is set for one of the most powerful psychological hooks known to behavioral science. Intermittent reinforcement. A notification appears on your phone. Sometimes it's something interesting, a message from a friend, an amusing video, news that actually matters. But most of the time it's nothing. Spam, advertisements, or updates you don't care about. Yet every ping still triggers the same small surge of anticipation. Will this be the one? Will this be rewarding? This is intermittent reinforcement, and it's the psychological principle behind every addiction, every obsession, every behavior that continues despite inconsistent rewards. Unlike continuous reinforcement, where every action produces a predictable result, intermittent reinforcement provides rewards randomly. And paradoxically, this randomness makes the behavior more compelling, not less. Modern influencers exploit this ancient programming with surgical precision. They don't provide constant attention or validation that would become boring, predictable, taken for granted. Instead, they alternate periods of intense engagement with stretches of unavailability. Their responses are sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, sometimes non-existent. This unpredictability keeps others constantly guessing, constantly hoping for the next positive interaction. The phenomenon was discovered by psychologist B.F. Skinner in experiments with pigeons. Birds that received food pellets every time they pecked a button quickly learned the association but stopped when the food disappeared. Birds that received food randomly, sometimes after one peck, sometimes after 20, sometimes not at all, became obsessed. They would peck frantically for hours, even when no food had appeared for long stretches. Human beings operate on the same psychological architecture. We're wired to find unpredictable rewards irresistible because, in nature, this trait helped us survive. Food, mates, and safety were never guaranteed. Those who gave up too easily starved or failed to reproduce. Those who persisted through uncertainty passed their genes to the next generation. Dating provides perhaps the clearest example of intermittent reinforcement in action. The person who is sometimes available, sometimes distant, sometimes affectionate, sometimes cold, often generates more intense attraction than someone who is consistently caring. The unpredictability keeps the other person psychologically engaged, always wondering about the next interaction, always hoping this time will be different. The technique becomes especially potent when combined with variable ratio schedules, where the reinforcement comes after an unpredictable number of responses. A boss who occasionally acknowledges good work, but never on a predictable schedule, can maintain higher motivation than one who provides regular, expected praise. Watch how this plays out in professional relationships. A manager who gives feedback irregularly, sometimes praise, sometimes criticism, often silence, creates more psychological engagement than one who provides consistent, predictable responses. Employees become hyper-focused on those rare moments of recognition, willing to work harder for uncertain rewards than they would for guaranteed ones. And when that obsession begins to form, when someone becomes psychologically hooked on unpredictable rewards, their decision-making shifts in profound ways. They begin to evaluate choices, not based on rational analysis, but on the emotional state they happen to be in when the decision must be made. But the true masters understand that intermittent reinforcement must be carefully calibrated. Too little reward, and people give up. Too much, and the behavior becomes predictable and boring. The sweet spot lies in providing just enough positive response to maintain hope while keeping the outcome uncertain enough to maintain obsession. Hot-cold empathy gaps. You're hungry, genuinely, distractingly hungry. Someone asks you to plan next week's meals, and you find yourself ordering far more food than you typically eat. You're buying steaks, desserts, elaborate ingredients for complex recipes. 3 hours later, after you've eaten, you look at the grocery list and wonder what you were thinking. Who is going to consume all this food? This is the hot-cold empathy gap, our inability to accurately predict how we'll feel or behave when we're in a different emotional state. When we're hungry, we can't imagine being satisfied. When we're satisfied, we can't remember what hunger felt like. When we're angry, we make decisions we'll regret. When we're calm, we underestimate how powerful anger can be. Master manipulators understand this psychological blind spot and exploit it ruthlessly. They don't just present their offers, they wait for or create the emotional state that makes their target most vulnerable to the specific decision they want them to make. They understand that the same person will make completely different choices depending on their emotional state at the moment of decision. Watch how this operates in retail environments. Stores don't just rely on attractive displays and competitive prices. They create emotional states that lead to specific behaviors. Luxury retailers use soft music, elegant lighting, and refined scents to create a mood where expensive purchases feel appropriate, even necessary. Fast food restaurants use bright colors, upbeat music, and time pressure to create urgency that overrides health concerns. The technique becomes especially powerful when it involves fear followed by relief. A home security salesperson doesn't just explain the benefits of their system, they tell stories about break-ins in your neighborhood, show statistics about crime rates, help you imagine your family's vulnerability. Then, when anxiety is at its peak, they offer their solution. In that moment of emotional intensity, the price seems irrelevant compared to the peace of mind being offered. Insurance sales often follows this pattern. Agents don't lead with policy details. They create vivid scenarios of disaster, help prospects imagine the financial devastation of being unprotected, and then present insurance as the obvious solution. The decision is made in a state of fear-induced urgency that the person might find difficult to understand when they're calm and rational. But the most sophisticated application involves creating positive emotional states that lead to expansive thinking and generous behavior. A charity fundraiser doesn't just ask for donations. They first share uplifting stories of lives changed, create feelings of hope and connection, and then request support while those positive emotions are at their peak. The timing is everything. Skilled practitioners understand that emotional states are temporary windows of opportunity. Strike too early, and the emotion hasn't reached sufficient intensity. Wait too long, and the moment passes, leaving the person wondering why they felt so strongly about something that now seems less urgent. The phenomenon reveals something unsettling about human decision-making. We're not the rational, consistent beings we imagine ourselves to be. Our choices fluctuate wildly based on temporary emotional states, yet we act as if each decision reflects our true, stable preferences. This gap between who we are in different emotional moments creates endless opportunities for those who understand how to navigate between our various selves. And when fear becomes the dominant emotion, when anxiety spreads through our thoughts like shadow through water, even our most carefully constructed defenses begin to crumble. Fear then relief sequences. The phone rings at 3 a.m. There's been an accident, the voice says. Your heart stops. Images flood your mind. Hospital rooms, devastating injuries, irreversible loss. Then, after what feels like an eternity, but is probably only seconds, the voice continues. Just some minor damage to the car, but we need to talk about your insurance coverage. In that moment of overwhelming relief, when terror transforms into gratitude, you'll agree to almost anything. The contrast between imagined catastrophe and actual minor inconvenience makes any reasonable request seem not just acceptable, but necessary. Your defenses, shattered by fear and reconstructed by relief, are temporarily non-existent. This is the fear-then-relief sequence, the deliberate creation of anxiety followed by its resolution, leaving the target in a state of heightened compliance and gratitude. It works because our brains don't just respond to absolute states, but to contrasts, to changes in circumstance. The relief feels proportionally intense to the fear that preceded it. Master practitioners don't rely on phone calls at 3 a.m. They create this psychological sequence in more subtle, socially acceptable ways. A financial advisor might begin a consultation by reviewing all the ways their client's current investment strategy could lead to disaster: market crashes, inflation, inadequate retirement savings. Only after thoroughly exploring these catastrophic scenarios do they present their solution. The relief of having a plan feels immense compared to the anxiety of facing an uncertain financial future. The technique appears everywhere once you recognize the pattern. A doctor discusses the serious complications that could arise from an untreated condition before recommending a procedure. A mechanic explains all the ways your car could break down before suggesting preventive maintenance. A cybersecurity consultant details the devastating effects of a data breach before proposing their protection services. But the true artistry lies in making the fear feel genuine and immediate, not manufactured. The anxiety must seem like a natural consequence of the situation being discussed, not an artificial creation designed to manipulate. When done skillfully, the person experiences the fear as their own realization, their own dawning awareness of danger, rather than something being imposed on them. The relief phase must be equally authentic. It can't feel like a sales pitch disguised as a solution. It must feel like genuine help, like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. The practitioner positions themselves not as someone exploiting fear, but as someone providing rescue from a genuinely threatening situation. Timing becomes crucial in this technique. The relief must follow quickly enough that the fear hasn't had time to fade, but not so quickly that it seems scripted. There should be a moment, brief but perceptible, where the person sits with their anxiety, feels its full weight, before the solution appears. The most sophisticated applications layer multiple fear relief cycles within a single interaction, gradually building trust and compliance through repeated cycles of anxiety and rescue. Each sequence makes the person more dependent on the practitioner's guidance, more grateful for their protection, more willing to follow their recommendations. Yet sometimes the most effective psychological pressure comes not from creating new fears, but from awakening the guilt that already lives quietly in the shadows of consciousness. Guilt leverage points. Your mother calls. She doesn't say she's lonely, doesn't directly complain about how rarely you visit. Instead, she mentions how the neighbor's children stop by every Sunday for dinner. She talks about how quiet the house has become, how she's been looking through old photo albums. By the end of the conversation, you're making plans to drive 3 hours next weekend, even though you have a dozen other commitments. This is guilt leverage, the identification and activation of existing shame to influence behavior. It works because most people carry a reservoir of guilt about various aspects of their lives. We feel guilty about not being better children, partners, friends, employees, citizens. These guilt points exist regardless of manipulation. Skilled influence simply locates and activates them. The technique doesn't create guilt from nothing. That would be too obvious, too artificial. Instead, it finds the guilt that already exists and gently brings it to the surface, making it impossible to ignore. A fundraiser for a homeless shelter doesn't accuse you of being heartless. They simply describe the cold nights, the empty stomachs, the children sleeping in cars, and let your own conscience draw the connections. Master practitioners develop an intuitive sense for reading guilt patterns. They notice what makes someone's expression change, what topics cause shoulders to tense or voices to become defensive. They understand that guilt often hides behind rationalization, behind busy schedules and competing priorities. Their role is to make the underlying moral tension visible. Watch how this operates in professional settings. A manager doesn't directly accuse an employee of letting the team down. They mention how everyone else is working late, how important the project is to the company's future, how much they've personally invested in making it succeed. The guilt emerges naturally from the employee's own sense of responsibility and fairness. The technique becomes especially potent when it taps into identity-based guilt. I thought you were someone who cared about the environment. You always seemed like such a family person. I didn't expect someone with your values to. The guilt isn't just about specific actions, it's about the gap between who the person sees themselves as being and how their current behavior appears. But the most sophisticated applications involve what psychologists call survivor guilt, the discomfort people feel when they have advantages others lack. A luxury car salesperson might casually mention how fortunate the customer is to have such success, how rare it is for someone to achieve what they've achieved. The subtext is clear. With great fortune comes the responsibility to enjoy it, to not let success go to waste through false modesty or excessive frugality. Religious and political movements have long understood the power of collective guilt. They don't just appeal to individual conscience, they create shared responsibility for societal problems. While we've been comfortable, others have suffered. Our silence has enabled injustice. We've benefited from systems that disadvantage others. The guilt becomes not just personal but communal, creating pressure for group action. The danger in guilt leverage is that it can create compliance without genuine commitment. People may act to relieve their discomfort rather than out of authentic conviction. This can lead to resentment, to behaviors that meet the letter of what was requested while violating its spirit. Yet when guilt gives way to something even more powerful, when the desire to avoid loss becomes stronger than the hope of gain, rational decision-making often disappears entirely. The contrast principle. Two restaurants sit side by side. The first has a modest exterior, simple decor, and reasonable prices. The second is dimly lit, clearly dirty, with a handwritten menu featuring surprisingly expensive items for what appears to be low-quality food. Where do you choose to eat? The choice seems obvious. The first restaurant wins by default. But that second restaurant isn't trying to win customers. Its purpose is to make the first restaurant look exceptional by comparison. This is the contrast principle in action, the manipulation of perception through strategic juxtaposition. Our brains don't evaluate things in isolation. We judge expensive versus cheap, large versus small, attractive versus unattractive, good versus bad. Control the comparison set, and you control the judgment. This isn't just a sales technique. It's a fundamental aspect of how human perception operates. Real estate agents master this principle by showing properties in strategic sequence. They don't start with the house they want you to buy. They start with overpriced disasters, homes with obvious flaws, unreasonable prices, or locations that make their actual target property seem like a miracle of value and quality by comparison. The technique works because contrast affects not just our opinions, but our actual perception. After holding your hand in ice water, room temperature feels warm. After looking at a distorted face, a normal face appears unusually attractive. After considering a terrible option, a mediocre option can seem outstanding. But master practitioners understand that the contrast must be believable. If the bad option is too obviously planted, people see through the manipulation and become resistant to all suggestions. The inferior choice must seem like a genuine alternative that you're seriously considering, not a straw man designed to make something else look good. Watch how this operates in negotiations. A skilled negotiator doesn't just make their offer, they help you understand what your alternatives look like. They research your other options, find their weaknesses, and ensure those flaws are clearly visible when comparisons are made. Your best alternative to their proposal suddenly seems less attractive than it did before the conversation began. The principle extends beyond simple good versus bad comparisons into more sophisticated psychological territory. A job recruiter might describe the high-stress, demanding nature of positions at competing companies before discussing the balanced, supportive culture at their own organization. The contrast isn't just about compensation or benefits, it's about entire ways of life. Dating apps and matchmaking services use this principle extensively. They understand that attraction is largely relative. Show someone a series of less attractive profiles, and the target profile appears more desirable. Present someone with a stream of highly attractive but clearly unavailable options, and a more realistic prospect seems achievable and appealing. The most sophisticated applications create multiple layers of contrast all at once. Imagine walking into a luxury car dealership. First, you're shown the economy models, setting a baseline in your mind. Next, they lead you to luxury cars that look worn and neglected, planting the idea of what happens without proper care. Then they show you older but well-kept models, proof that even the best eventually age. And only after this build-up do they unveil the brand-new model, shiny, flawless, promising to sidestep all those problems while offering even more. But contrast can be emotional as well as material. A counselor helping someone evaluate a relationship might first explore all the ways things could go wrong, the potential for conflict, disappointment, or growing apart, before helping them recognize the positive elements they might be taking for granted. And when that emotional contrast creates a sense of what might be lost, when possibilities begin to feel precious precisely because they seem to be slipping away, the psychology of scarcity begins to work its ancient magic on modern minds. Emotional labor extraction. She listens to your problems, offers thoughtful advice, remembers details from previous conversations. She asks about your family, your work stress, your dreams for the future. The relationship feels meaningful, supportive, genuine. Only gradually do you realize that the conversation always somehow circles back to her goals, her projects, her needs for assistance. You've become emotionally invested in her success without quite understanding how it happened. This is emotional labor extraction, the systematic harvesting of others' emotional energy, attention, and care to serve one's own purposes. It works because humans are naturally empathetic creatures. We form bonds, we invest in others' well-being, we feel responsible for those who have shared their vulnerabilities with us. The technique begins with authentic-seeming emotional exchange. The practitioner shares personal stories, admits to struggles, reveals insecurities. This vulnerability creates the illusion of mutual openness and balanced relationship. But look closely, and you'll notice the imbalance. Their problems are always solvable with your help. Your problems, while acknowledged, somehow never become the focus of sustained attention. Master practitioners of this technique understand that emotional investment creates a sense of ownership. When someone shares their dreams with you, helps you understand their challenges, allows you to feel useful in addressing their struggles, you begin to feel partially responsible for their success. Their wins become your wins, their failures reflect on your helpfulness. The psychology operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There's the reciprocity principle. They've given you their trust, so you owe them your support. There's the sunk cost fallacy. You've already invested so much emotional energy that walking away feels like waste. And there's the helper's high, the genuine satisfaction that comes from feeling needed and useful. Watch how this manifests in professional relationships. A colleague consistently brings their problems to you, values your advice, makes you feel like a trusted confidant. Gradually, you find yourself staying late to help with their projects, covering for their mistakes, advocating for their promotions. The emotional connection feels real, and it is real, but it's been carefully cultivated to serve their career advancement. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with intermittent vulnerability. The practitioner doesn't constantly need help that would become burdensome and obvious. Instead, they share struggles periodically, just often enough to maintain emotional connection, but not so frequently that you feel used. The timing seems natural, driven by life circumstances rather than manipulation. Digital environments have made emotional labor extraction both easier and more sophisticated. Social media allows people to broadcast their struggles to wide audiences, harvesting sympathy and support from dozens or hundreds of connections simultaneously. The emotional investment is distributed across many people, making the extraction less obvious to any individual contributor. But the most insidious applications involve creating artificial crises that require emotional rescue. The practitioner finds themselves in situations, relationship problems, work conflicts, family dramas that seem to demand immediate support and advice. You drop everything to help, to listen, to offer assistance. Only later do you recognize the pattern of recurring emergencies that always seem to require your specific type of help. The technique reveals something profound about human connection, our need to feel useful, to matter in others' lives, to have our care and attention valued. These needs are genuine and healthy. The manipulation lies in the systematic exploitation of these needs to serve ends that were never disclosed, never negotiated, never agreed to. And when emotional energy has been harvested and carefully directed, when someone feels deeply invested in another person's success, the simple act of stepping back, of becoming temporarily unavailable, can create powerful psychological pressure. Validation withdrawal. For weeks, she responds to your messages immediately. She laughs at your jokes, remembers your stories, seems genuinely interested in your thoughts and opinions. You begin to count on her attention, to structure your day around your conversations with her. Then, suddenly, something changes. Messages go unanswered. Calls aren't returned. The warmth disappears, replaced by polite distance. You find yourself analyzing every interaction, wondering what you did wrong. You replay conversations, looking for the moment things shifted. You send more messages, trying to recapture the connection you felt. The more she withdraws, the more desperately you pursue. Her attention, once freely given, has become a prize you're willing to work harder to earn. This is validation withdrawal, the strategic removal of positive attention to create psychological hunger for its return. It works because humans are social creatures wired to seek approval and connection. When someone whose opinion we value suddenly becomes distant, our minds interpret this as a threat to our social standing and relationships. The technique exploits the psychological principle of intermittent reinforcement, but with a crucial twist. Instead of randomly providing rewards, the practitioner establishes a pattern of consistent positive attention, allows the target to become dependent on it, then strategically removes it. The withdrawal creates anxiety that the previous attention never generated. Master practitioners understand that the initial period of validation must be genuinely rewarding. People must come to genuinely value the attention being offered. This can't be faked or rushed. Authentic appreciation for someone's positive regard takes time to develop. Only when that appreciation is established can withdrawal become an effective influence tool. The psychology operates on both conscious and unconscious levels. Consciously, the person notices the change in attention and begins to wonder why it occurred. Unconsciously, their brain interprets the withdrawal as social rejection, triggering ancient survival mechanisms designed to restore group acceptance. The combination creates powerful motivation to regain the lost validation. Watch how this operates in professional settings. A manager who typically provides regular feedback and recognition suddenly becomes distant and formal. The employee, accustomed to positive attention, begins to question their performance, to work harder for acknowledgement, to seek meetings and opportunities to demonstrate their value. The withdrawal of validation has created motivation more powerful than any direct request for improved performance. The technique becomes especially effective when the withdrawal appears to be based on the target's behavior rather than the practitioner's manipulation. I thought we had a good relationship, but lately you seem... The implication is that the target has somehow damaged the connection, that restoring it requires them to change their behavior or attitudes. Dating provides perhaps the clearest examples of validation withdrawal in action. Someone who was once attentive and affectionate becomes distant and distracted. The partner, feeling the loss of emotional connection, begins to work harder for attention, becoming more accommodating, more available, more willing to overlook problems they previously would have addressed. The most sophisticated applications involve graduated withdrawal. The validation doesn't disappear entirely. That might cause the target to give up and look elsewhere. Instead, it becomes intermittent, unpredictable, harder to earn. This creates an addictive cycle where the person works increasingly hard for decreasing and uncertain rewards. But validation withdrawal reveals something darker about human psychology, our desperate need for approval, our willingness to alter ourselves to regain lost attention, our tendency to blame ourselves when others withdraw their regard. It's a technique that works precisely because it activates our deepest social fears and insecurities. Yet sometimes the most powerful influence comes not from withdrawing validation, but from projecting an unshakable confidence that makes doubt itself seem impossible. Projected confidence. The surgeon enters the operating room. She doesn't announce her qualifications, doesn't list her successful procedures, doesn't argue for her approach. She simply begins working with such complete certainty, such absolute confidence in her decisions, that everyone else falls into line. Nurses anticipate her needs. Residents hang on her every word. The patient's family, seeing her unwavering assurance, feels their anxiety dissolve. Doubt becomes impossible in the presence of such absolute conviction. This is projected confidence, the strategic display of certainty to override others' uncertainty. It works because human beings are wired to follow those who seem to know where they're going. In moments of confusion or crisis, we instinctively look for someone who appears to have answers, who seems untroubled by the complexities that overwhelm us. But true projected confidence goes far beyond mere bravado or false bravery. It's a carefully calibrated display of certainty that feels authentic because it's grounded in apparent competence. The confidence doesn't announce itself. It emerges naturally from the person's actions, their decision-making speed, their apparent comfort with complexity that intimidates others. Master practitioners understand that projected confidence must be contextual. The confidence displayed in a boardroom differs from what works in a classroom, which differs from what succeeds in a social setting. The certainty must fit the situation, addressing the specific anxieties and uncertainties that exist in that particular environment. Watch how this operates in leadership transitions. A new manager doesn't spend time learning the existing systems or asking for input from experienced team members. Instead, they immediately begin making decisions, issuing directives, restructuring processes. Their confidence in their approach makes questioning seem petty or resistant. The team faced with such certainty begins to doubt their own understanding of what works. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with strategic vulnerability. The practitioner isn't confident about everything that would seem arrogant and unrealistic. Instead, they're absolutely certain about the areas that matter most, while showing appropriate humility about less critical details. This selective confidence feels more authentic and credible. Physical presence plays a crucial role in projected confidence. Posture, eye contact, vocal tone, and movement patterns all contribute to the impression of certainty. Someone who speaks slowly and clearly, who takes up appropriate space, who makes direct eye contact while discussing important points, projects an assurance that becomes contagious. But the most sophisticated applications involve confidence about outcomes that can't be immediately verified. A consultant doesn't just express certainty about their approach, they project confidence about results that won't be measurable for months or years. Their certainty about future success becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy as others begin to act in ways that make those predictions more likely to come true. The psychology works because uncertainty is uncomfortable. When faced with complex decisions, multiple options, or ambiguous situations, people experience anxiety that they're naturally motivated to resolve. Someone who projects complete confidence offers relief from that discomfort, a sense that at least one person understands what's happening and where things are heading. Yet projected confidence can be dangerous when it's ungrounded in actual competence. History is filled with examples of charismatic leaders whose certainty led groups toward disaster. The technique works regardless of whether the confidence is justified, which makes it a powerful but potentially destructive tool. And when confidence combines with the subtle art of borrowing credibility from sources that seem impressive but remain difficult to verify, the influence becomes almost impossible to resist. The halo effect manipulation. The presentation begins with a single slide, a photo of the speaker shaking hands with a Nobel Prize winner. No words, no explanation, just the image. The audience's perception shifts immediately. This isn't just another consultant. This is someone connected to greatness, someone who moves in circles of excellence. Everything they say afterward carries additional weight, borrowed from that single moment of association with recognized achievement. This is halo effect manipulation, the strategic use of positive associations from one area to create credibility in completely unrelated domains. It works because our brains use shortcuts to evaluate trustworthiness and competence. If someone has achieved success, recognition, or association with excellence in any field, we unconsciously assume they possess general competence and wisdom. The technique doesn't require false claims or fabricated credentials. Instead, it involves the careful presentation of genuine achievements or associations in ways that create broader impressions of expertise. A financial advisor mentions their college athletic achievements not because physical fitness relates to investment advice, but because athletic success suggests discipline, goal orientation, and the ability to perform under pressure. Master practitioners understand that the halo effect is strongest when the positive association feels relevant while actually being unrelated. A management consultant discusses their military experience, allowing the audience to transfer impressions of leadership, strategic thinking, and crisis management from the military context to the business world. The connection seems logical but doesn't necessarily predict consulting success. Watch how this operates in professional networking. Someone introduces themselves not just by current role, but by weaving in impressive past associations, the Fortune 500 company they once worked for, the prestigious university they attended, the well-known people they've collaborated with. These associations create a halo of competence that influences how their current ideas and proposals are received. The technique becomes especially powerful when the positive association is recent and visible. A speaker begins their presentation by mentioning they just returned from consulting with an impressive organization or recently collaborated with a recognizable expert. The temporal proximity makes the halo effect stronger and more immediate. Social media has made halo effect manipulation both easier and more sophisticated. Profile photos can be strategically chosen to show association with impressive settings, people, or events. Professional summaries can highlight prestigious affiliations or accomplishments that create positive impressions across all subsequent interactions. But the most elegant applications involve layering multiple halos to create compound credibility. A combination of educational credentials, professional associations, personal achievements, and social connections creates a constellation of positive impressions that makes questioning competence feel almost churlish. The psychology works because transferring judgments between categories is cognitively efficient. Rather than evaluating each new person and situation from scratch, our brains look for patterns and associations that allow for quicker decisions. If someone seems successful in one area, assuming general competence saves mental energy. Yet the halo effect can lead to systematic errors in judgment. Someone's athletic prowess doesn't predict their business acumen. Academic achievement doesn't guarantee practical wisdom. Professional success in one field doesn't transfer to expertise in another. But our brains make these connections automatically, often below the threshold of conscious awareness. And when halos begin to multiply, when positive associations accumulate and compound, they create psychological momentum that can carry someone far beyond what their actual capabilities might merit. Selective information feeding. You're researching a major purchase, a house, a car, an investment. A helpful advisor provides you with exactly the information you need: market analyses, comparison charts, expert opinions that all seem to point toward one obvious conclusion. You feel informed, empowered, confident in your decision-making. What you don't realize is that for every piece of information you received, 10 others were filtered out. The data feels comprehensive, but it's actually been carefully curated to guide you toward a predetermined conclusion. This is selective information feeding, the strategic control of what someone knows to shape how they think. It works because humans make decisions based on available information, and whoever controls that information flow controls the decision-making process. The technique is particularly powerful because the manipulation is invisible. The target feels they're making informed, independent choices based on thorough research. The artistry lies not in providing false information. Lies are risky and often unnecessary, but in choosing which truths to share and which to omit. A pharmaceutical sales representative visiting a doctor doesn't fabricate studies about their medication. Instead, they emphasize research that shows positive outcomes while downplaying studies that reveal side effects or suggest alternative treatments might be equally effective. Master practitioners understand that timing matters enormously in information feeding. The sequence in which information is presented affects how it's weighted and integrated into decision-making. Present positive information first, and it creates a favorable framework for interpreting everything that follows. Present challenges first, and solutions appear more valuable when they finally arrive. Watch how this operates in political campaigns. Voters aren't given false information about candidates, but they're given carefully selected true information designed to create specific impressions. Positive achievements are highlighted and explained in detail. Mistakes or failures are either omitted entirely or mentioned briefly without context. The resulting picture is accurate in every detail, but completely misleading in its overall impression. The technique becomes especially sophisticated when combined with apparent transparency. The information provider acknowledges that they're being selective, admits that other perspectives exist, but explains why they're focusing on particular data points. I know there are other ways to look at this, but I think the most relevant information for your situation is this: apparent honesty makes the selective feeding more palatable and less obvious. Digital environments have made information feeding both easier and more pervasive. Search engines, social media algorithms, and news aggregators all engage in selective information feeding, showing users content that aligns with their existing beliefs and interests. The result is the creation of information bubbles where people feel well informed while actually receiving only fragments of available knowledge. But the most insidious applications involve the gradual shaping of someone's entire information environment over time. Instead of manipulating a single decision, the practitioner slowly influences the sources, types, and framing of information the target encounters regularly. Over months or years, this shapes not just specific choices but entire worldviews and belief systems. The psychology works because people believe they're more informed than they actually are. In any complex situation, the amount of available information far exceeds what any individual can process. We rely on others to help us filter, prioritize, and interpret data. When those filters are controlled by someone with agenda, our sense of being well-informed becomes a liability rather than an asset. Yet information is just one battlefield in the war for influence. Sometimes the most effective approach involves not controlling what people know, but distorting how they understand what they know. The strawman redirect. The debate is about education funding. You argue for increased teacher salaries and smaller class sizes. Your opponent responds, "So you think we should just throw money at every problem? You want to bankrupt our communities to fund an educational system that's clearly broken beyond repair?" Suddenly, you're not defending your actual position anymore. You're trying to explain that you never suggested bankrupting anyone, that you don't think money solves everything, that you didn't say the system was beyond repair. This is the strawman redirect, the strategic misrepresentation of someone's argument to make it easier to attack. It works because once a distorted version of your position enters the conversation, you feel compelled to correct it. but every moment spent clarifying what you didn't say is a moment not spent advancing what you actually believe. The technique doesn't just win arguments, it controls the entire frame of discussion. Instead of debating the merits of your actual proposal, the conversation becomes about defending yourself from positions you never took. Your opponent gets to attack weak arguments they've created while avoiding engagement with your stronger, more nuanced actual position. Master practitioners don't create obviously ridiculous straw men. Those are too easy to identify and dismiss. Instead, they craft distortions that contain enough truth to seem plausible while exaggerating the implications to absurd extremes. They take your genuine position and stretch it just beyond the bounds of reasonableness. Watch how this operates in professional disagreements. A colleague proposes a new project management system. Instead of addressing the specific merits of their suggestion, someone responds, "So you want to completely abandon everything we've learned about how this company operates? You think we should ignore years of successful experience and start over from scratch?" The original proposal becomes unrecognizable in this distorted version. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with emotional triggers. The straw man isn't just logically flawed, it's morally questionable, socially irresponsible, or personally threatening. So you don't care about people's safety. You want to destroy the traditions that built this community? You think hardworking families should suffer for your experiments? Political discourse has elevated straw man manipulation to an art form. Complex policy positions get reduced to caricatures that bear little resemblance to what was actually proposed. Immigration reform becomes open borders. Environmental regulation becomes job-killing extremism. Healthcare reform becomes government takeover. The real proposals disappear beneath layers of inflammatory misrepresentation. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating straw men that seem to come from the target's own words. Selective quoting, removal of context and emphasis on particular phrases can make someone appear to have said something they never intended. The misrepresentation feels authentic because it uses their actual language, just in ways they never meant. The psychology works because humans have a strong drive for accuracy and fairness. When someone misrepresents our position, we feel compelled to correct the record. This defensive reflex takes energy and attention away from making our actual case. We become reactive instead of proactive, responding to their framing instead of advancing our own. Yet the straw man is just one form of misdirection. Sometimes the most effective manipulation involves not distorting the argument, but changing the subject entirely. Gaslighting techniques. You remember the conversation clearly. She promised to handle the client presentation, said she had everything under control, assured you that your concerns were unnecessary. Now, 2 days before the deadline, she looks at you with genuine confusion. "I never said I would do the whole presentation. I said I'd help if I had time. You must have misunderstood." You begin to doubt your own memory. Did you misinterpret what she said? Are you remembering it wrong? This is gaslighting. The systematic undermining of someone's confidence in their own perceptions, memories, and judgment. It works because memory is more fragile than most people realize. When someone consistently questions your recollection of events with apparent sincerity, you begin to question whether you can trust your own mind. The technique doesn't begin with dramatic denials of obvious facts. It starts subtly with minor discrepancies, small contradictions, gentle suggestions that your memory might be imperfect. "Are you sure that's exactly what happened? I remember it a bit differently. Maybe you're thinking of a different conversation." Over time, these small seeds of doubt grow into genuine uncertainty about your own perception of reality. Master practitioners of gaslighting understand that the technique works best when the target already has some reason to doubt themselves. Someone going through stress, dealing with complex situations, or managing multiple responsibilities is more likely to question their own memory when contradicted. The gaslighter positions themselves as helpful, offering clarity in moments of confusion rather than appearing to challenge or attack. Watch how this operates in professional environments. A manager consistently provides verbal instructions but never follows up with written confirmation. When deadlines are missed or projects go wrong, they express surprise. I never told you to do it that way. If that's what you understood, you should have asked for clarification. The employee, lacking documentation and facing apparent certainty from authority, begins to doubt their own comprehension and memory. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with false concern for the target's well-being. You seem really stressed lately. Are you sure you're remembering things clearly? Maybe you should take some time off. The gaslighter positions themselves as caring and supportive while simultaneously undermining the target's confidence in their own mental state. Digital communication has made gaslighting both easier and more dangerous. Text messages can be deleted, emails can be modified, and digital records can be selectively preserved or eliminated. Someone can deny sending a message, claim they said something different than what was written, or insist that electronic records support their version of events, while the target has no way to verify their own memories. But the most insidious applications involve gaslighting entire groups rather than individuals. An organization consistently changes policies, procedures, or expectations while insisting that nothing has changed. When employees struggle to adapt, leadership expresses concern about their resistance to change, their failure to understand clear instructions, their inability to keep up with simple requirements. The collective gaslighting makes individual resistance seem like personal failing rather than reasonable response to institutional manipulation. The psychology works because humans need coherent narratives to make sense of their experience. When someone consistently offers alternative explanations for events, particularly someone in a position of authority or trust, it becomes easier to doubt your own perceptions than to believe that someone you depend on is systematically lying to you. Yet gaslighting reveals something profound about the nature of reality itself, how dependent we are on social validation of our experiences, how easily our confidence in our own minds can be shaken, how much power we give to others to define what is true and what is false. And when doubt takes root in the mind, when uncertainty becomes the dominant state, even the most overwhelming complexity can be used as a weapon to prevent clear thinking. Information overload strategy. The contract arrives in your email, 47 pages of dense legal language, technical specifications, contingency clauses, and subsections referencing other documents you haven't seen. The deadline for review is tomorrow. The sender apologizes for the time pressure, but explains that the opportunity is time-sensitive, that waiting would mean losing competitive advantages, that everyone else has already agreed to similar terms. You skim the document, focusing on the main numbers, and sign. Only later do you discover the crucial details buried in Section 23, subsection 4C. This is information overload strategy, the deliberate provision of excessive complex information to prevent thorough analysis and encourage shortcuts in decision-making. It works because human attention and processing power are limited resources. When confronted with more information than we can reasonably analyze, we resort to mental shortcuts that can be predicted and exploited. The technique doesn't rely on hiding important information. That would be illegal in many contexts and risky in others. Instead, it buries crucial details within volumes of less important but legitimate content. The target receives comprehensive information. They just don't have the time, energy, or expertise to process all of it effectively. Master practitioners understand that information overload must be combined with time pressure to be most effective. Given unlimited time, most people could work through even complex documents and identify potential problems. But when forced to make quick decisions, they focus on the information that seems most relevant while glossing over details that might change their conclusions. The psychology operates on the principle of cognitive overload. When our mental processing capacity is exceeded, we automatically switch to simpler decision-making strategies. We look for familiar patterns, rely on trust in the information source, focus on the most prominent numbers or terms, and assume that less prominent details are less important. These shortcuts save mental energy but create opportunities for exploitation. Watch how this operates in business negotiations. A proposal arrives with extensive market research, competitive analyses, technical specifications, financial projections, implementation timelines, and risk assessments. The sheer volume of information suggests thoroughness and transparency, but buried within the technical specifications are assumptions that favor the proposer. Hidden in the financial projections are optimistic scenarios that may not be realistic. The risk assessments focus on unlikely dramatic failures while ignoring more probable moderate problems. The technique becomes especially powerful when the information appears to address the target's concerns comprehensively. Someone worried about costs receives detailed budget breakdowns with dozens of line items. Someone concerned about timeline gets project schedules with hundreds of tasks and milestones. The apparent thoroughness of the response makes questioning seem unreasonable, even though the underlying assumptions may be flawed. Digital environments have made information overload both easier to create and harder to detect. Websites can provide seemingly unlimited depth of information, creating the impression of transparency while making comprehensive review practically impossible. Terms of service agreements, privacy policies, and user agreements have grown to enormous length, ensuring that virtually no one reads them completely before agreeing. But the most sophisticated applications involve layering different types of information to create cognitive confusion. Technical data is mixed with financial projections, legal requirements are interwoven with marketing claims, historical precedents are combined with future speculation. The target's mind struggles to organize and evaluate such diverse information types simultaneously. The phenomenon reveals something troubling about modern decision-making. The tools that should help us make better choices, comprehensive information, detailed analysis, thorough documentation, can be weaponized against us when we lack the time, expertise, or mental capacity to process them effectively. And when information becomes too complex to analyze, when details blur together into incomprehensible noise, the mind becomes vulnerable to artificially simplified choices that feel like clarity but are actually elaborate illusions. False dilemma creation. The politician steps to the microphone. "We face a choice," he declares. "We can either support this defense budget and keep our families safe, or we can leave our nation vulnerable to those who wish us harm. The decision is simple: security or chaos, strength or weakness, protection or peril." The audience nods. The choice seems clear, urgent, obvious. But is it? Are those really the only two options? What about alternative defense strategies, diplomatic solutions, or different budget priorities that might achieve security more effectively? The politician has collapsed a complex landscape of possibilities into a simple binary choice, eliminating nuance, compromise, and creative alternatives from consideration. This is false dilemma creation, the artificial reduction of multiple options into two stark alternatives, typically one clearly preferable to the other. It works because binary thinking feels decisive and clear in a world that is often ambiguous and complex. When faced with uncertainty, humans are drawn to simple frameworks that promise clear answers and decisive action. The technique doesn't just present two options, it presents two options where one is obviously superior. You can either buy this insurance policy and protect your family, or you can gamble with their future. We can either implement this new system now and stay competitive, or we can fall behind and lose market share. The false choice makes the decision seem not just simple but inevitable. Master practitioners understand that the two options must feel genuinely comprehensive. The target should feel that all reasonable possibilities have been considered and that the choice truly captures the essence of the decision. This requires understanding what the target values most and framing the dilemma around those values. Watch how this operates in sales environments. A car salesperson doesn't present dozens of vehicles that would create decision paralysis. Instead, they quickly identify the customer's priorities and present two options that seem to encompass all relevant possibilities: the practical choice and the aspirational choice, the safe option and the exciting option, the budget-conscious selection and the feature-rich alternative. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with time pressure and emotional stakes. The deadline for enrollment is tomorrow. You can either sign up now and secure your spot, or you can wait and risk losing this opportunity forever. The false urgency makes the binary choice feel even more compelling. Social and political movements have long relied on false dilemma creation to mobilize supporters. Complex social issues get reduced to simple moral choices. You're either part of the solution or part of the problem, either supporting justice or enabling oppression, either moving forward or holding back progress. The nuanced middle ground, where most practical solutions exist, disappears from view. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating false dilemmas that seem to emerge naturally from the situation rather than being imposed by the influencer. Given the constraints we're facing, I see only two viable paths forward. The limitation appears to come from circumstances rather than from someone's desire to control the decision. The psychology works because eliminating options reduces cognitive load and decision anxiety. When faced with many choices, people often become paralyzed by possibilities. Two clear alternatives provide relief from complexity while creating the illusion that all relevant factors have been considered. The mind embraces the simplification, even when it comes at the cost of better solutions. Yet when false choices combine with powerful emotional appeals, when the stakes feel personal and immediate, rational analysis often surrenders to the more primitive forces that drive human behavior. Red herring deployment. The meeting is about budget overruns on the marketing campaign. As questions grow pointed and accountability seems inevitable, the marketing director suddenly shifts focus. Before we get into the details, I think we need to address the bigger issue here. Our competitors are gaining market share, and if we don't act decisively, we could lose our leadership position entirely. The room's energy pivots. Instead of discussing budget management, everyone begins debating competitive strategy. The original issue, overspending on a campaign that failed to deliver results, quietly fades into the background. This is red herring deployment, the strategic introduction of irrelevant but emotionally compelling information to divert attention from uncomfortable topics. It works because human attention is easily hijacked, especially when the distraction seems more urgent, interesting, or emotionally engaging than the original subject. The technique doesn't deny or dismiss the original issue. That would be too obvious and might increase focus on the problem. Instead, it introduces something that feels more important, more timely, or more worthy of immediate attention. The red herring must be genuinely relevant to the broader context while being irrelevant to the specific issue at hand. Master practitioners understand that effective red herrings must trigger stronger emotional responses than the topics they're designed to replace. A discussion about process improvements gets redirected toward stories of customer complaints. A review of individual performance becomes a conversation about industry-wide challenges. The new topic feels more urgent, more significant, more deserving of the group's limited time and attention. Watch how this operates in personal relationships. A conversation about broken promises gets redirected toward the stress and pressure the promise breaker has been under. A discussion about household responsibilities becomes a debate about work-life balance and societal expectations. The original issue, specific behaviors that need to change, gets lost in broader philosophical discussions that feel more important but address nothing concrete. The technique becomes especially powerful when the red herring involves shared concerns or common enemies. A political candidate facing questions about policy failures shifts focus to their opponent's character flaws. A CEO discussing disappointing quarterly results pivots to industry-wide challenges and regulatory burdens. The distraction unifies the audience around external threats while diffusing focus on internal problems. Digital communication has made red herring deployment both easier and more sophisticated. Social media algorithms reward engagement, meaning that provocative diversions often receive more attention than substantive discussions of complex issues. A single inflammatory tweet can redirect entire news cycles away from important but less sensational topics. But the most elegant applications involve red herrings that seem to emerge naturally from the conversation rather than being deliberately introduced. That reminds me of something even more concerning. This situation is actually part of a larger pattern. The diversion feels organic, like a natural evolution of the discussion rather than a calculated misdirection. The psychology works because attention is a limited resource that flows toward the most compelling stimuli available. When something more interesting, threatening, or emotionally engaging enters the conversation, minds naturally gravitate toward it. The original topic doesn't need to be resolved, it just needs to be outcompeted for mental bandwidth. Yet red herrings reveal something troubling about modern discourse, our collective inability to maintain focus on important but difficult issues when more exciting distractions are available. The technique succeeds not because people are stupid, but because human attention operates in predictable ways that can be exploited by those who understand the mechanics of distraction. And when attention has been successfully diverted, when focus has been scattered across multiple concerns, the stage is set for one of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation, the gradual erosion of someone's confidence in their own judgment. To Quoque, the investigation is closing in. Evidence mounts, questions become pointed. Then, at the moment when accountability seems inevitable, the accused leans forward with indignation. How can you question my ethics when your own department has been plagued by scandals? When your organization has repeatedly failed to meet its own standards? When the very people pointing fingers have questionable track records themselves? The room's energy shifts. Suddenly, the investigation feels less like justice and more like hypocrisy. The accusers find themselves on the defensive, explaining their own past mistakes instead of pursuing the current inquiry. The original question, what did this person do, and when did they do it, gets lost in a spiral of mutual recrimination. This is tu quoque, Latin for you too, the strategic deflection of criticism by pointing out the critic's own flaws or failures. It works because it transforms accountability into an exercise in comparative morality. Instead of addressing the specific allegation, the conversation becomes about whether anyone has the right to judge anyone else. The technique doesn't deny wrongdoing or claim innocence. It simply makes the case that everyone is guilty of something, that moral authority is an illusion, that criticism is inherently hypocritical. The logic is seductive. If no one is perfect, then no one can rightfully condemn anyone else. Every accusation becomes an invitation to examine the accuser's history. Master practitioners understand that tu quoque works best when the counter-accusation contains enough truth to feel valid. They don't invent flaws in their critics. They research them, identify real problems, and deploy them strategically when under pressure. The deflection feels justified rather than desperate because it points to genuine issues. Watch how this operates in political discourse. A candidate facing corruption charges immediately pivots to their opponent's financial dealings. A party confronting ethical violations responds by cataloging the other side's scandals. The original accusation never gets resolved because both sides become locked in an escalating cycle of mutual condemnation. The technique becomes especially powerful when it taps into broader themes of fairness and selective enforcement. Why are you targeting me when others have done the same thing and faced no consequences? The implication is that the real problem isn't the behavior in question, but the unfair application of standards. The critic becomes the villain, guilty of bias, selective justice, or political motivation. Corporate environments provide fertile ground for tu quoque deployment. An executive facing questions about budget overruns points to other departments' financial irregularities. A manager confronting performance issues highlights their critics' own management failures. The focus shifts from solving specific problems to debating who has the moral standing to identify problems in the first place. But the most sophisticated applications involve preemptive tu quoque, attacking critics' credibility before they can raise specific issues. Before we discuss this matter, I think it's important to acknowledge the conflicts of interest and personal motivations that may be influencing some people's perspectives. The criticism is undermined before it can be fully articulated. The psychology works because moral authority is fragile and easily questioned. When someone's own imperfections are highlighted, their capacity to judge others feels compromised. The Quoque doesn't need to prove that the original criticism is wrong, it just needs to establish that the critic lacks the moral standing to make such judgments. Yet the technique reveals something troubling about human nature, our willingness to abandon the pursuit of truth when it becomes tangled with questions of moral authority. We become so focused on who has the right to judge that we forget to ask whether the judgment itself is accurate. And when moral authority has been successfully undermined, when all voices seem equally compromised, the mind becomes vulnerable to the dangerous assumption that isolated examples represent universal truths. Hasty generalization. The news story is compelling. A local teacher has been arrested for financial fraud, stealing money from the school's fundraising account to pay personal debts. The comment section erupts immediately. This is what's wrong with public education. Teachers can't be trusted with taxpayer money. The whole system is corrupt. One person's criminal behavior becomes evidence of systemic failure. Individual misconduct transforms into categorical condemnation. This is hasty generalization, drawing sweeping conclusions from insufficient evidence, using isolated examples to make claims about entire groups or systems. It works because human brains are pattern recognition machines, constantly seeking to make sense of the world by finding connections and drawing conclusions from limited information. The technique doesn't require false information or fabricated examples. It simply takes genuine incidents and extrapolates from them far beyond what the evidence supports. One bad experience with customer service becomes proof that the entire company doesn't care about its customers. A single investment loss demonstrates that a particular strategy is fundamentally flawed. An isolated failure proves that an entire approach is doomed to fail. Master practitioners understand that hasty generalization works best when it confirms existing suspicions or biases. People are predisposed to believe negative information about groups they already distrust, positive information about causes they already support, and dramatic conclusions about situations they already find concerning. The generalization doesn't create new beliefs, it validates and amplifies existing ones. Watch how this operates in professional settings. A new software system crashes during its first week of implementation. Instead of treating this as a predictable part of any technology rollout, critics use the incident to argue that the entire modernization effort is misguided, that new systems are inherently unreliable, that change itself is dangerous and should be avoided. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with emotional storytelling. Abstract statistics about crime rates have less impact than vivid anecdotes about specific victims. Broad economic trends feel less urgent than personal stories of individual hardship. The singular narrative carries more psychological weight than comprehensive data, making generalization feel not just reasonable but necessary. Social media has amplified the reach and impact of hasty generalization exponentially. A single tweet about a negative experience can generate thousands of shares, creating the impression that the problem is widespread and systemic. Isolated incidents become viral controversies. Individual mistakes transform into calls for sweeping reforms. Personal grievances evolve into social movements. But the most insidious applications involve using hasty generalization to discredit entire categories of evidence or expertise. One scientist makes an error, therefore scientific consensus cannot be trusted. One journalist gets a story wrong, therefore media reporting is unreliable. One expert changes their opinion, therefore expertise itself is suspect. The psychology works because generalization is a fundamental cognitive tool that helps us navigate a complex world efficiently. We can't evaluate every situation from scratch. We need to use past experience to make predictions about future encounters. The problem arises when we generalize from too little evidence, or when our generalizations are exploited by those who understand how pattern recognition can be manipulated. Yet hasty generalization reveals something profound about human cognition, our deep need to find meaning and patterns in experience, even when the data is insufficient to support the conclusions we draw. We prefer coherent but inaccurate narratives to accurate but incomplete information. And when those narratives become crystallized into firm beliefs, they create psychological momentum that makes us vulnerable to influence from anyone who seems to possess the authority to interpret the patterns we think we see. Appeal to authority. The advertisement is simple but effective. A woman in a white lab coat, stethoscope around her neck, holding a bottle of vitamins. As a doctor, she says, "I recommend these supplements to all my patients." The research is clear. This formula provides everything your body needs for optimal health. The title beneath her name reads Dr. Sarah Johnson, Medical Professional. What the ad doesn't mention is that Dr. Johnson is a veterinarian whose expertise lies in treating animals, not humans, and that she's being paid $50,000 for this endorsement. This is appeal to authority, using someone's credentials or status to validate claims without requiring actual evidence. It works because humans evolved in small groups, where recognizing and deferring to expertise was essential for survival. When the tribal elder warned of danger or the skilled hunter suggested strategy, listening could mean the difference between life and death. This ancient programming remains active in modern environments where the stakes are usually lower, but the psychological triggers are just as powerful. The technique doesn't require genuine expertise in the relevant field. It just requires the appearance of authority. A Nobel Prize winner in physics becomes a spokesperson for financial investments. A successful business executive offers opinions on climate science. A famous actor advocates for medical treatments. Their authority in one domain creates a halo effect that extends to completely unrelated areas. Master practitioners understand that modern authority often comes from visibility rather than competence. Social media has created a new category of expert, the influencer whose authority derives from follower count rather than knowledge. Someone with millions of subscribers giving advice on relationships, finances, or health may have no formal training or proven track record in these areas, but their platform creates the impression of expertise. Watch how this operates in corporate environments. A consulting firm doesn't just present their recommendations, they emphasize the prestigious clients they've served, the awards they've won, the recognition they've received from industry publications. The implication is that these external validations prove the quality of their current advice, even though past success doesn't guarantee future wisdom. The technique becomes especially powerful when multiple authorities seem to agree. 9 out of 10 experts recommend. The statistic sounds compelling, but it rarely includes information about how the experts were selected, what their qualifications are, or whether they have conflicts of interest that might bias their opinions. The appearance of consensus can be manufactured through careful selection of which experts to include and which to ignore. Academic credentials provide particularly powerful authority markers because they're difficult for most people to evaluate. A PhD in any field can seem impressive to those unfamiliar with academic specialization. Someone with a doctorate in 18th century literature may have little relevant knowledge about modern educational policy, but their academic credentials can make their opinions carry more weight than they deserve. But the most sophisticated applications involve borrowed authority, associating with prestigious institutions or recognized experts without claiming direct expertise. The approach I'm recommending is consistent with research from Harvard Medical School. This strategy is similar to what Fortune 500 companies have used. The authority comes not from personal credentials, but from association with respected sources. The psychology works because evaluating expertise requires expertise. Most people lack the knowledge necessary to assess whether someone truly understands the subject they're discussing. It's cognitively easier to rely on external markers of authority, titles, degrees, institutional affiliations, media recognition, than to evaluate the substance of what's being claimed. Yet appeal to authority reveals something troubling about modern information environments. The gap between the appearance of expertise and actual competence has never been larger. In a world where anyone can create content, build an audience, and position themselves as an expert, traditional markers of authority may be less reliable than ever. And when false authorities multiply, when credentials can be manufactured and expertise can be performed, the mind seeks other shortcuts to navigate an increasingly complex landscape of competing claims. Gambler's fallacy. The roulette wheel has landed on red 7 times in a row. The crowd around the table grows tense with anticipation. Black is due, someone whispers. It has to be black this time. Bets shift heavily toward black squares. The mathematical probability remains exactly the same, 50-50 for each spin, completely independent of previous results. But the human brain rebels against this cold logic, insisting that patterns must balance, that streaks must end, that the universe keeps score. This is the gambler's fallacy, the mistaken belief that past events affect future probabilities in independent situations. It works because humans are pattern-seeking creatures who evolved to find meaningful connections in their environment. When we see a sequence of similar outcomes, our minds automatically assume that change is not just likely, but overdue. The fallacy extends far beyond casino floors into boardrooms, investment decisions, and everyday life. A baseball player strikes out 3 times in a row, and fans become convinced he's due for a hit. A successful entrepreneur's last 2 ventures failed, making investors believe their next project is more likely to succeed. A job candidate has been rejected by 5 companies, leading them to feel confident that the 6th interview will surely result in an offer. Master manipulators exploit this fallacy by creating or highlighting streaks that make their desired outcomes seem statistically inevitable. A sales manager points out that the last 4 prospects said no, suggesting that the next one is much more likely to say yes. A lottery ticket vendor mentions that their location hasn't had a big winner in months, implying that a jackpot is overdue. A dating coach tells clients that previous rejections increase their chances of future acceptance. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with emotional investment in the outcome. Someone who has already made several unsuccessful attempts feels psychologically compelled to continue, convinced that their persistence will be rewarded by probability's eventual balance. The more they've invested, the more certain they become that success must be coming soon. Watch how this operates in financial markets. Investors see a stock decline for several consecutive days and assume it's oversold, that a rebound is mathematically inevitable. They increase their positions based not on company fundamentals or market analysis, but on the simple belief that what goes down must come up. The fallacy can drive both individual investment decisions and broader market movements. The psychology becomes more complex when dealing with situations that aren't truly random. Human behavior, unlike roulette wheels, can be influenced by past events. A salesperson who has been rejected several times might become more desperate, actually decreasing their chances of future success. A team that has lost several games might lose confidence, making additional losses more likely rather than less. But the most insidious applications involve creating artificial streaks through selective reporting or framing. A marketing campaign emphasizes how long it's been since customers received a particular type of offer, suggesting that recipients are due for this special deal. A political candidate highlights their opponent's recent mistakes, implying that additional errors are statistically likely to follow. The phenomenon reveals something profound about human psychology, our deep discomfort with randomness, and our need to find order even in chaos. We prefer the illusion of predictable patterns to the reality of uncertainty. This preference makes us vulnerable to those who understand how to manufacture the appearance of meaningful sequences in random events. Yet the gambler's fallacy is just one way our minds can be led astray by false patterns. Sometimes the manipulation involves not predicting what will happen next, but creating artificial equivalences between things that are fundamentally different. False equivalence. The debate moderator turns to the panel. We have 2 perspectives on climate change tonight. Dr. Rebecca Martinez has spent 30 years studying atmospheric science, published over 100 peer-reviewed papers, and serves on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Representing the skeptical view is Tom Bradley, a blogger and former marketing executive who runs the website Climate Sense Now. Let's hear both sides of this important issue. The format suggests equal credibility, balanced expertise, comparable authority, but the equivalence is artificial. One panelist represents the overwhelming consensus of climate scientists based on decades of rigorous research. The other represents a minority opinion based primarily on political ideology and selective interpretation of data. Yet the presentation makes both views seem equally valid, equally worthy of consideration. This is false equivalence, treating fundamentally unequal things as if they deserve equal consideration. It works because fairness feels reasonable, and most people have been taught that every story has two sides. The technique exploits our sense of justice and our desire to appear open-minded, even when that openness gives undeserved credibility to demonstrably false or harmful ideas. The manipulation often hides behind the language of balance and objectivity. Let's look at both sides. There are different perspectives on this issue. Reasonable people can disagree. These phrases sound neutral and fair, but they can create false impressions of equal validity when the evidence overwhelmingly supports one position over another. Master practitioners understand that false equivalence doesn't require identical treatment, it just requires treatment that suggests comparable legitimacy. A medical expert and a celebrity wellness guru might not receive identical introduction or equal time, but presenting them on the same platform implies that both perspectives deserve serious consideration from the audience. Watch how this operates in news media. A story about vaccine safety might include quotes from epidemiologists and public health officials, followed by quotes from parents who believe vaccines harm their children. The parents' concerns are genuine and their pain is real, but their anecdotal experience doesn't carry the same evidentiary weight as rigorous scientific studies involving hundreds of thousands of subjects. The technique becomes especially powerful when it involves moral rather than factual equivalence. Political coverage that presents both major candidates as flawed but viable options creates the impression that their flaws are comparable in magnitude and significance, even when objective analysis might reveal dramatic differences in competence, honesty, or policy positions. Corporate communications often rely on false equivalence to deflect criticism. A company facing allegations of environmental damage might present the issue as a debate between environmental activists and business leaders, as if both groups' opinions carry equal weight in determining scientific facts about ecological harm. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating false equivalence not between people or organizations, but between different types of evidence or reasoning. Peer-reviewed scientific research gets presented alongside social media speculation. Historical documentation gets balanced against conspiracy theories. Expert analysis receives equal treatment with popular opinion. The psychology works because genuine equivalence is often difficult to assess. Most people lack the expertise necessary to evaluate whether two positions truly deserve equal consideration. They rely on contextual cues, how the options are presented, who endorses them, what platforms they're given to make judgments about relative credibility. Yet false equivalence reveals something troubling about modern information environments, the difficulty of distinguishing between legitimate debate and artificial controversy. When everything is presented as having two sides, we lose the ability to recognize when the evidence clearly supports one position over others. And when false equivalences multiply, when every certainty becomes debatable, the mind seeks refuge in simpler heuristics, like assuming that groups of high-quality parts will automatically create high-quality outcomes. Composition fallacy. The startup's pitch deck is impressive. They've hired the former CTO of Google, the ex-head of marketing from Apple, and the previous chief financial officer from Amazon. Each individual brings outstanding credentials, proven track records, and specialized expertise. The investors nod approvingly. With talent like this, one says, how can they fail? 6 months later, the company implodes amid interpersonal conflicts, strategic disagreements, and competing visions that never aligned into coherent direction. This is the composition fallacy, assuming that what's true for individual parts must be true for the whole. It works because excellence in isolation feels like a guarantee of excellence in combination. Our minds naturally expect that assembling the best components will create the best result, but reality is more complex than this intuitive logic suggests. The fallacy appears everywhere once you recognize the pattern. A football team signs the league's top players at every position, then struggles because their playing styles don't complement each other. A restaurant uses the finest ingredients available but creates dishes where the flavors clash and compete rather than harmonize. A committee of brilliant individuals produces mediocre reports because their different approaches to problem-solving never merge into unified methodology. Master manipulators exploit this fallacy by emphasizing individual qualifications while ignoring questions of integration, compatibility, and synergy. They present collections of impressive elements, credentials, features, testimonials, statistics, and allow audiences to assume that combining these elements will produce proportionally impressive results. Watch how this operates in product marketing. A smartphone advertiser emphasizes their device's best-in-class camera, fastest available processor, longest-lasting battery, and most advanced display. Each specification represents genuine excellence, but the advertisement doesn't address how these components work together, whether the powerful processor drains the long-lasting battery, or if the advanced display competes with the camera for processing resources. The technique becomes especially powerful in service-based industries where the quality of individual providers suggests the quality of the organization. A consulting firm highlights the prestigious backgrounds of their team members, Harvard MBAs, former Fortune 500 executives, industry award winners. The implication is that combining such talent guarantees superior consulting outcomes regardless of whether these individuals can collaborate effectively or share compatible methodologies. Educational institutions often rely on composition fallacy reasoning in their marketing. They emphasize the quality of individual professors, the excellence of specific programs, the prestige of particular partnerships, and the success of notable alumni. Prospective students are left to assume that these individual strengths combine into an overall educational experience that matches the sum of its impressive parts. But the most sophisticated applications involve layering multiple types of excellence to create overwhelming impressions of quality. A financial advisory firm doesn't just mention their advisors' credentials, they also highlight their research department's awards, their technology platform's capabilities, their client service ratings, and their firm's longevity. Each element represents genuine quality, but their combination might not produce the superior results that clients expect. The psychology works because evaluation of complex wholes requires understanding of systems, relationships, and emergent properties that are difficult for most people to assess. It's much easier to evaluate individual components and assume that better parts lead to better outcomes. This cognitive shortcut serves us well in many situations, but creates vulnerabilities in contexts where integration matters more than individual excellence. Yet the composition fallacy reveals something profound about human expectations, our preference for simple cause and effect relationships, even in complex systems where outcomes depend more on interaction patterns than on component quality. We want to believe that assembling the best pieces guarantees the best results, even when experience teaches us otherwise. And just as we assume that great parts create great wholes, we often make the opposite error, believing that strong organizations automatically produce strong individual members. Division fallacy. The prestigious law firm has a sterling reputation, century-long history, landmark cases, celebrity clients, offices in major cities worldwide. When they offer you a position, friends congratulate you on joining the best legal minds in the country. The assumption is natural. If the firm is excellent, every lawyer within it must be excellent too. But 3 months into the job, you discover that competence varies dramatically. Some colleagues are brilliant, Others are mediocre, and a few seem to survive primarily on the firm's reputation rather than their own abilities. This is the division fallacy, assuming that what's true for the whole must be true for each individual part. It works because humans use mental shortcuts to evaluate people and situations. When we know something positive about a group or organization, we automatically transfer those positive attributes to everyone associated with it, often without evidence that the individual deserves such attribution. The fallacy becomes especially powerful when combined with prestigious affiliations. Someone who attended Harvard must be brilliant. After all, Harvard is a world-class institution. Someone who works for Goldman Sachs must be an exceptional financier. The firm's reputation speaks for itself. Someone who plays for the New York Yankees must be a superior athlete. They wouldn't be on the team otherwise. Each assumption carries some statistical validity, but ignores the variation that exists within even the most selective organizations. Master manipulators exploit this fallacy by strategically emphasizing group affiliations while downplaying the need to demonstrate individual competence. They lead with organizational credentials, prestigious associations, and institutional accomplishments, allowing audiences to make assumptions about personal capabilities that may or may not be accurate. Watch how this operates in professional networking. Someone introduces themselves not just by name and role, but by organizational affiliation. I'm with McKinsey. I work at the Fed. I'm from Stanford's business school. The institutional reputation does most of the credibility work, creating positive impressions before any individual qualifications are discussed. The technique becomes especially effective when the prestigious affiliation is recent or temporary. A consultant mentions their work with Fortune 500 companies without specifying that they spent 3 weeks on a minor project for one such company 5 years ago. A speaker references their research at MIT without clarifying that they were a visiting scholar for a single semester. The association is technically accurate but creates impressions far beyond what the actual relationship warrants. Academic and professional credentials provide particularly fertile ground for division fallacy exploitation. Medical schools, law schools, and business schools vary dramatically in their standards, curricula, and graduate outcomes, yet many people treat all degrees from good schools as equivalent. The institutional reputation transfers to individual graduates regardless of their actual performance, class rank, or post-graduation accomplishments. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating the impression of selective association without explicit claims. Someone prominently displays photos with impressive people, mentions casual conversations with industry leaders, or references insights gained from discussions with experts. The implied association suggests that they move in circles of excellence, that they've been vetted by successful people, that their own competence has been validated by proximity to greatness. The psychology works because evaluating individual competence requires time, effort, and often specialized knowledge. It's cognitively efficient to use group reputation as a proxy for individual quality. This shortcut produces reasonably accurate judgments in many situations. Prestigious organizations do tend to attract talented people, but the correlation isn't perfect, and the exceptions can be significant. Yet the division fallacy reveals something important about how reputation and credibility function in modern society. Individual achievement increasingly depends not just on personal competence, but on association with respected institutions and impressive people. The fallacy succeeds because it reflects a partial truth. Group affiliations do provide meaningful information about individuals, even when that information is incomplete or misleading. And when institutional credibility has been established, when someone seems to carry the authority of prestigious associations, they become positioned to offer what appears to be the most reasonable approach to complex problems, the sensible middle ground. Middle ground fallacy. The committee has been debating for hours. One faction insists that the new policy should be implemented immediately and applied universally. Another argues that no changes should be made to the current system. As tension builds and positions harden, the facilitator suggests a compromise. Why don't we pilot the new policy in just 3 departments and evaluate the results after 6 months? That way, we're neither rushing into change nor avoiding it entirely. The room nods with relief. The suggestion feels wise, balanced, reasonable. But is the middle ground always the right place to be? What if the evidence overwhelming supports immediate full implementation? What if the current system is genuinely failing and partial measures won't address the fundamental problems? The compromise feels fair and measured, but it might simply split the difference between a right answer and a wrong one, creating a solution that satisfies no one and solves nothing. This is the middle ground fallacy, the assumption that the truth or best solution must lie somewhere between opposing positions. It works because moderation feels virtuous, extremism feels dangerous, and splitting differences appears to honor both perspectives while avoiding conflict. But reality doesn't always arrange itself conveniently between opposing viewpoints. The fallacy becomes especially seductive in polarized environments where taking any strong position feels socially risky. When two sides are shouting at each other, the person who suggests a calm middle path appears wise, mature, above the fray. They get credit for reasonableness regardless of whether their suggested compromise actually makes logical or practical sense. Master practitioners exploit this by intentionally taking extreme positions that make their true goals appear moderate by comparison. A negotiator opens with an outrageous demand not because they expect acceptance, but because it makes their real objective, which might still be quite favorable to them, seem like a reasonable compromise. The middle ground isn't genuinely balanced. It's been artificially created by manipulating where the extremes appear to be. Watch how this operates in political discourse. When debating healthcare policy, one side might advocate for completely privatized medicine, while another calls for total government control. A third party proposes a sensible middle approach that combines elements of both systems. The compromise sounds reasonable, but the extreme positions might have been staked out precisely to make this predetermined middle solution appear optimal. The technique becomes especially powerful when the stakes are high and the pressure for resolution is intense. In crisis situations, people become desperate for solutions that everyone can accept, even if those solutions don't actually address the underlying problems. The middle ground offers the appearance of progress without requiring anyone to admit they were completely wrong. Corporate environments provide fertile ground for middle ground fallacy exploitation. A manager facing pressure to choose between two competing strategies might combine elements of both, creating a hybrid approach that lacks the advantages of either original plan while incorporating the disadvantages of both. The compromise feels diplomatic, but often produces inferior results. But the most sophisticated applications involve framing issues so that the extreme positions are actually reasonable, while the middle ground serves the manipulator's interests. A vendor negotiating a contract might present their standard pricing as a compromise between premium service rates and budget options, when in reality their standard pricing was their target all along. The psychology works because humans are conflict-averse and often equate fairness with splitting differences. We've been taught that reasonable people can find middle ground, that compromise is a virtue, that truth usually lies somewhere between opposing extremes. These are often valuable principles, but they become liabilities when exploited by those who understand how to manufacture artificial extremes. The fallacy reveals something troubling about modern decision-making, our preference for solutions that feel balanced over solutions that are actually effective. We often choose approaches that honor multiple perspectives rather than approaches that address actual problems. The result can be policies, strategies, and solutions that satisfy everyone's need to be heard while solving no one's actual needs. And when the middle ground has been artificially constructed, when compromise becomes more important than correctness, attention can be diverted to focus on carefully selected evidence while ignoring everything that doesn't support the predetermined conclusion. Texas Sharpshooter Fallacy. The market research is impressive. 37 data points showing strong correlation between customer satisfaction and product features, 15 case studies demonstrating successful implementations, 12 testimonials from clients praising specific outcomes. The presentation builds a compelling case for the proposed strategy. What it doesn't mention are the 43 data points that showed no correlation, the 8 case studies where implementation failed, or the 25 clients who reported negative experiences. The evidence feels comprehensive, but it's been cherry-picked from a much larger dataset that tells a very different story. This is the Texas Sharpshooter fallacy, focusing on similarities while ignoring differences, then declaring a meaningful pattern exists. The name comes from a joke about a gunman who shoots randomly at a barn, then paints targets around the holes to make it look like he's an excellent marksman. The pattern isn't real. It's been created after the fact by selectively highlighting certain data while ignoring everything else. The fallacy works because humans are naturally drawn to patterns and stories that make sense of complex information. When someone presents evidence that seems to support a clear conclusion, we rarely ask about the evidence that wasn't presented. The visible pattern feels meaningful and compelling, even though it might be meaningless when viewed in full context. Master practitioners of this technique understand that they don't need to fabricate evidence. They just need to curate it carefully. In any large data set, some information will support almost any conclusion you want to draw. The art lies in selecting the most impressive supporting evidence while ensuring that contradictory information never enters the conversation. Watch how this operates in business presentations. A software company promotes their product by highlighting the clients who achieved spectacular results, the company that increased productivity by 40%, the organization that cut costs by 30%, the team that improved customer satisfaction by 50%. These success stories are real and impressive, but they don't represent typical outcomes. The average results, the implementations that failed, the clients who saw minimal improvement, those stories are quietly omitted from the presentation. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with statistical manipulation. A pharmaceutical company might tout their drug's effectiveness by emphasizing the studies where it performed best, while downplaying or ignoring studies where it performed poorly. They're not lying about the positive results. Those studies genuinely exist and their findings are accurate, but the selective presentation creates a false impression of the medication's overall effectiveness. Academic research can fall victim to this fallacy when researchers focus on data that supports their hypotheses while ignoring or minimizing contradictory findings. Publication bias makes this problem worse. Journals are more likely to publish studies with positive results than studies that find no effect, creating a literature that systematically overrepresents successful interventions and underrepresents failures. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating the appearance of independent validation. Instead of cherry-picking from a single study, practitioners collect favorable findings from multiple sources, creating the impression that diverse research consistently supports their position. Each individual finding might be accurate, but the collection doesn't represent the full scope of available evidence. The psychology works because pattern recognition is fundamental to human cognition. We evolved to find meaningful connections in our environment, to identify trends that might predict future events, to extract useful information from complex situations. This valuable capability becomes a vulnerability when exploited by those who understand how to manufacture the appearance of meaningful patterns. The fallacy reveals something important about the modern information environment. The abundance of data makes cherry-picking easier and more convincing than ever before. With enough information available, skilled manipulators can construct compelling narratives to support almost any conclusion. The challenge for audiences is distinguishing between genuine patterns and artificial ones created through selective evidence presentation. And when artificial patterns have been established, when selective evidence has created the illusion of clear conclusions, the stage is set for one of the most pervasive manipulations in modern society, the assumption that natural equals better. Appeal to nature. The advertisement is simple but effective. A pristine forest, morning sunlight filtering through ancient trees, and text overlaying the image, natural ingredients. The way nature intended. Chemical-free wellness for your family. The product, an herbal supplement, seems pure, safe, beneficial by virtue of its natural origins. What the advertisement doesn't mention is that some of the most deadly substances known to humans are completely natural: ricin, botulinum toxin, cyanide, deathcap mushrooms. Meanwhile, many life-saving medications are synthetic: insulin for diabetics, antibiotics for infections, chemotherapy drugs for cancer patients. This is the appeal to nature fallacy. The assumption that natural things are inherently good, safe, or superior, while artificial things are inherently bad, dangerous, or inferior. It works because natural carries powerful emotional associations with purity, health, tradition, and harmony with the environment. These associations feel intuitively correct, even when they're logically unfounded. The technique doesn't require explicit claims about safety or effectiveness. The word natural does the persuasive work implicitly. Consumers transfer their positive feelings about nature in general to specific products that claim natural origins. The marketing doesn't need to prove that natural ingredients work better. It just needs to activate the psychological preference for things perceived as unprocessed, unaltered, authentic. Master practitioners understand that the appeal to nature works best when contrasted with scary-sounding alternatives. Natural becomes more appealing when positioned against chemicals, artificial ingredients, synthetic compounds, or processed substances. The contrast makes the natural option feel not just preferable but necessary for health and well-being. Watch how this operates in food marketing. All natural appears on products that may contain natural ingredients that are nonetheless unhealthy in large quantities. Natural sugars, natural fats, natural preservatives that can be just as problematic as synthetic alternatives. The term carries legal requirements in some contexts, but often functions more as marketing language than meaningful product description. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with fear appeals about modern life, industrial processes, or technological advancement. The implication is that humans lived more healthily in the past when they consumed only natural substances, conveniently ignoring the reality that pre-modern life expectancy was dramatically shorter and that many historical health problems were solved through artificial interventions. Personal care and wellness industries rely heavily on appeal to nature positioning. Chemical-free skincare products, ignoring that everything, including water, is composed of chemicals, natural weight loss supplements, some of which can be dangerous. And organic personal care items where organic certification may have little relevance to safety or effectiveness, all leverage positive associations with naturalness. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating artificial categories of natural and unnatural that serve marketing purposes rather than reflecting meaningful distinctions. A product might be labeled natural because one ingredient comes from plants, even though the processing required to extract and stabilize that ingredient involves extensive chemical manipulation. The psychology works because humans evolved in natural environments and maintain emotional connections to nature that can override rational analysis. We feel safer with things that seem familiar, traditional, unchanged by human intervention. These preferences made sense in ancestral environments, but can lead to poor choices in modern contexts where natural doesn't always mean safe and artificial doesn't always mean dangerous. The fallacy reveals something important about modern consumer psychology: our deep ambivalence about technological progress, and our nostalgic idealization of a simpler, more natural past that may never have existed. We want the benefits of modern life while maintaining the illusion that we can return to some mythical state of natural purity. And when natural becomes synonymous with better, when artificial becomes synonymous with dangerous, rational evaluation of costs and benefits becomes almost impossible, especially when those costs have already been paid and feel too significant to abandon. Sunk cost fallacy. 3 hours into the movie, you shift uncomfortably in your seat. The plot is incoherent. The acting is terrible, and the dialogue makes you cringe. But you've already invested so much time and paid for the ticket that leaving now feels like waste. You stay for another hour of misery rather than admit that the first 3 hours were already gone forever. The money was spent the moment you bought the ticket. The time was lost the moment you realized the movie was bad. But something in your mind insists that enduring more suffering will somehow justify the initial investment. This is the sunk cost fallacy, the tendency to continue investing in something because of what has already been invested, even when continuing no longer makes rational sense. It works because humans hate waste and loss more than they value potential gains. We'd rather throw good money after bad than admit that our previous investments were mistakes. The fallacy operates on both emotional and logical levels. Emotionally, abandoning an investment feels like admitting failure, accepting that we made poor decisions, acknowledging that our efforts were wasted. Logically, our minds create narratives where persistence will eventually vindicate past investments. If we just try a little harder, invest a little more, wait a little longer, the situation will turn around and our original investment will prove worthwhile. Master manipulators exploit this by creating situations where targets feel invested before making major commitments. A timeshare salesperson doesn't start by asking you to buy property. They invite you to attend a presentation, take a tour, imagine living in the location. Each small step increases your psychological investment, making it harder to walk away when the real sales pitch begins. Watch how this operates in professional relationships. A consulting project begins with small engagements, a brief assessment, a preliminary report, a pilot program. By the time problems become apparent, the client has already invested time, resources, and reputation in the relationship. Changing course feels like admitting that all previous investment was wasted, so they continue funding ineffective work rather than cutting their losses. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with incremental commitment. Each additional investment feels small compared to what has already been committed, even though the cumulative total grows far beyond what would have been acceptable as an upfront cost. A software implementation begins with reasonable licensing fees, then adds training costs, then requires custom development, then needs additional hardware. Each step feels justifiable given previous commitments. Business environments are filled with sunk cost thinking. Projects continue long past their viability because teams have already invested months of work. Strategies persist despite poor results because organizations have built systems around them. Products remain in development despite changing market conditions because companies have already spent millions on research and development. But the most insidious applications involve creating artificial investment to increase commitment. A service provider asks clients to complete extensive preparation work before beginning the actual engagement. The preparation has minimal value, but it creates psychological investment that makes clients less likely to seek alternatives when problems arise. The psychology works because loss aversion is built into human decision-making. We feel the pain of losses more acutely than the pleasure of equivalent gains. This asymmetry makes abandoning investments feel disproportionately painful, even when continuing to invest leads to greater total losses. The fallacy reveals something profound about human nature, our difficulty accepting that some investments are simply lost, that some decisions were simply wrong, that some paths lead nowhere regardless of how much we've already walked down them. We prefer the illusion of eventual vindication to the reality of immediate loss acceptance. Yet sometimes the most compelling evidence comes not from complex analysis or expert opinion, but from vivid personal stories that feel more real than abstract data. Anecdotal evidence. The woman's story is heartbreaking and compelling. She stands before the committee, holding a photo of her daughter, and describes how a routine vaccination led to developmental regression, how her bright, active child suddenly stopped speaking, stopped engaging, lost skills she had already mastered. The room is silent, moved by her obvious pain and sincere conviction. Her testimony carries emotional weight that no statistical study could match. What it doesn't carry is scientific validity that could justify policy changes affecting millions of other children. This is anecdotal evidence, using personal experiences or individual stories as proof of broader patterns. It works because stories feel more real, more immediate, more convincing than abstract data. We connect with individual narratives in ways that statistics can never match. One person's vivid experience can outweigh thousands of carefully controlled studies in terms of psychological impact. The technique doesn't require false stories. The most powerful anecdotal evidence is completely true and genuinely moving. A single person's authentic experience of job loss can seem more compelling than unemployment statistics. One family's struggle with healthcare costs can carry more emotional weight than policy analysis. An individual's success story can feel more convincing than research on average outcomes. Master practitioners understand that anecdotal evidence works best when it confirms what audiences already suspect or fear. A story about government waste resonates with people already skeptical of bureaucracy. A tale of corporate malfeasance appeals to those already distrustful of big business. A narrative about miraculous recovery attracts those already hoping for alternative medical solutions. Watch how this operates in product marketing. Instead of citing clinical studies or performance data, advertisements feature testimonials from real customers whose lives were transformed by the product. These stories are often genuine, but they represent the most extreme positive outcomes rather than typical results. The dramatic individual success overshadows the more modest improvements experienced by average users. The technique becomes especially powerful when the person sharing their story seems similar to the target audience. A working mother's endorsement carries more weight with other working mothers than a celebrity's paid endorsement. A small business owner's success story resonates more with other entrepreneurs than abstract market research. The perceived similarity creates identification that makes the anecdotal evidence feel personally relevant. Political campaigns rely heavily on anecdotal evidence to illustrate policy positions. Instead of presenting complex economic analysis, they introduce voters to individuals whose lives exemplify particular problems or solutions. These personal stories make abstract issues concrete and emotionally engaging, but they can also create misleading impressions about the prevalence of particular problems or the effectiveness of proposed solutions. But the most sophisticated applications involve layering multiple anecdotes to create the impression of widespread patterns. A series of individual stories, each compelling on its own, can seem to constitute evidence of systematic problems or consistent benefits. The collection of anecdotes feels more authoritative than any single story while still maintaining the emotional impact that makes anecdotal evidence persuasive. The psychology works because human brains evolved to learn from stories and personal experiences. For most of human history, individual narratives were the primary source of information about cause and effect. We're wired to pay attention to what happened to specific people in particular situations, because that information was often the most reliable guide to navigating similar circumstances ourselves. The fallacy reveals something important about modern decision-making, the tension between emotional resonance and statistical validity. The information that feels most convincing to our minds, vivid, personal, emotionally engaging, is often the least reliable guide to understanding complex systems and making decisions that affect large populations. And when personal stories begin to feel more authoritative than systematic analysis, when emotional impact outweighs empirical evidence, the mind becomes vulnerable to arguments that seem logical but rest on subtle shifts in meaning. Equivocation. The politician steps to the podium, confidence radiating from his posture and voice. "I have never," he declares, "taken money from lobbyists to influence my vote on any piece of legislation." The statement is technically accurate. What he doesn't mention is the $50,000 he received from a lobbying firm for a consulting fee 2 days after voting on a bill that benefited their clients. The payment wasn't technically for influencing his vote. It was for consulting services. The word taken could be interpreted to mean accepted rather than actively solicited. And perhaps the payment didn't technically influence his vote since he was already planning to vote that way. This is equivocation, using words with multiple meanings in misleading ways, allowing the same term to shift meaning within an argument to create false impressions while maintaining technical accuracy. It works because language is inherently ambiguous, and skilled manipulators can exploit those ambiguities to say things that seem to mean one thing while technically meaning another. The technique relies on the difference between literal truth and communicative intent. The equivocator's words are carefully chosen to be factually accurate under narrow interpretations while creating broader impressions that may be completely false. They're not lying in the traditional sense. They're manipulating the natural ambiguity of language to mislead without technically deceiving. Master practitioners understand that equivocation works best when the audience lacks the knowledge or context necessary to identify the semantic sleight of hand. Technical terminology, legal language, and specialized jargon all provide rich opportunities for equivocation because most people don't understand the precise definitions that experts use in specific fields. Watch how this operates in advertising and marketing. A product is labeled sugar-free while containing artificial sweeteners that may have their own health risks. A service is described as unlimited while actually having significant restrictions buried in fine print. A warranty promises lifetime coverage without clearly defining whose lifetime or what specific damages are covered. Each claim is technically accurate while potentially misleading. The technique becomes especially powerful in legal and regulatory contexts, where precise language matters enormously. A company might claim compliance with environmental standards by meeting the literal requirements while violating the spirit of the regulations. A financial institution might describe products as safe by using a technical definition of safety that doesn't match most consumers' understanding of the term. Corporate communications often rely on equivocation to manage public relations crises. A company might take responsibility for problems without actually accepting legal liability. They might express regret about outcomes without admitting wrongdoing. They might promise to address issues without committing to specific solutions or timelines. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating entire conversations where key terms shift meaning without anyone noticing. A discussion about fairness might begin with fairness, meaning equal treatment, but gradually shift to fairness, meaning equal outcomes, then to fairness, meaning proportional representation, then to fairness, meaning historical compensation. Each shift seems natural in context, but the cumulative change transforms the entire debate. The psychology works because humans naturally assume that others use words the same way they do. When someone uses a familiar term, we automatically supply our own definition and assume they mean the same thing. We rarely stop to verify that shared vocabulary actually represents shared understanding. The equivocation reveals something troubling about modern communication: the ease with which shared language can mask fundamental disagreements about meaning and values. We think we're having the same conversation when we're actually discussing completely different concepts that happen to use the same words. And when meanings become fluid, when words can shift their significance mid-conversation, the stage is set for even more dramatic distortions, comparisons that seem logical but rest on fundamentally false similarities. False analogy. The CEO addresses the workforce with confidence and conviction. "Running this company is just like coaching a football team," he declares. "We need discipline, strategy, and everyone working toward the same goal. Just as a coach makes tough decisions about who plays and who sits on the bench, I have to make tough decisions about personnel and resources. And just like in football, we win or lose as a team." The analogy sounds compelling: leadership and teamwork translated into familiar sports metaphors that everyone can understand. But is a company really like a football team? Football players have clearly defined roles, specific positions, and standardized rules that everyone agrees to follow. The objective is simple and measurable: score more points than the opponent. Success and failure are obvious and immediate. Corporate environments involve much more ambiguous goals, constantly changing rules, and success metrics that may not be apparent for months or years. Employees didn't voluntarily sign up to be benched or cut from the team. The analogy creates an illusion of clarity and purpose while obscuring the complex realities of organizational management. This is false analogy, comparing two things as if they're similar in important ways when they're actually fundamentally different. It works because analogies help us understand complex situations by relating them to familiar experiences. When someone draws a comparison between something new and something we already understand, our minds naturally transfer our feelings and expectations from the familiar situation to the unfamiliar one. The technique relies on highlighting genuine similarities while ignoring crucial differences. The CEO's football analogy captures some real aspects of organizational life: coordination, shared objectives, leadership decision-making, but it obscures important differences that make the comparison misleading. The emotional appeal of the familiar metaphor makes the differences fade into the background. Master practitioners understand that effective false analogies must feel intuitively correct even when they're logically flawed. The similarities must be vivid and emotionally resonant, making the differences seem trivial or irrelevant by comparison. The analogy doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be compelling enough to shape how people think about the situation. Watch how this operates in political discourse. A candidate argues that government should be run like a business because both organizations need to manage budgets, make efficient decisions, and serve their constituencies. The analogy appeals to voters frustrated with government inefficiency, but it ignores fundamental differences. Businesses exist to generate profit for owners, while governments exist to serve public interests. Businesses can choose their customers while governments must serve all citizens. Business failures affect shareholders, while government failures affect entire societies. The technique becomes especially powerful when it taps into moral or emotional associations. Comparing military action to surgery suggests precision, necessity, and healing. Describing immigration as a flood implies overwhelm, damage, and loss of control. Characterizing economic policies as medicine suggests that short-term pain leads to long-term health. Each analogy carries emotional baggage that influences how people evaluate the actual situation. Legal arguments often rely on analogical reasoning, comparing current cases to previous decisions or precedents. While analogy is a legitimate form of legal reasoning, false analogies can distort justice by emphasizing superficial similarities while ignoring crucial differences between situations. A case involving digital privacy might be compared to physical searches, but the analogy might break down when applied to the scale and permanence of digital information. But the most sophisticated applications involve layered analogies that create entire frameworks for understanding complex issues. Climate change gets compared to war, requiring mobilization and sacrifice, to disease requiring diagnosis and treatment, or to investment requiring present costs for future benefits. Each analogy shapes not just opinions but entire approaches to addressing the problem. The psychology works because analogical thinking is fundamental to human cognition. We understand new situations by comparing them to familiar ones. This powerful mental tool allows us to navigate complexity and make decisions quickly. But the same mechanism that helps us learn and adapt can be exploited to create false understanding and misguided decisions. The false analogy reveals something important about human reasoning: our tendency to prefer simple, familiar explanations over complex, unfamiliar ones, even when the simple explanations lead us astray. We'd rather have clear but wrong answers than ambiguous but accurate ones. And when false clarity has been established through misleading comparisons, the mind becomes vulnerable to questions that aren't really questions at all, but traps disguised as innocent inquiries. Loaded question. The interview seems to be going well until the journalist leans forward with a knowing look. "Mr. Johnson," she says, "can you explain why your company continues to prioritize profits over employee safety?" The executive's face tightens. How does he answer that? Denying the premise makes him look defensive. Agreeing with it admits to something that may not be true. Attempting to reframe the question makes him appear evasive. The question itself has become a trap, built on assumptions that may be completely false. This is the loaded question, an inquiry that contains hidden premises or assumptions that put the respondent in an impossible position. It works because questions appear neutral and reasonable, but loaded questions embed accusations, false dilemmas, or unproven claims within what seems like a simple request for information. The technique doesn't require obviously hostile or aggressive questioning. The most effective loaded questions sound thoughtful, concerned, even sympathetic. What are you planning to do about your reputation for poor customer service? Assumes poor reputation exists without establishing evidence. How will you address voters' concerns about your judgment? Implies that concerns about judgment are widespread and legitimate without proving either point. Master practitioners understand that loaded questions work by controlling the frame of discussion. Instead of allowing the respondent to present their perspective, the question forces them to respond within predetermined parameters. They must either accept false premises or spend their time challenging the question itself rather than advancing their own position. Watch how this operates in media interviews and press conferences. Reporters don't just ask, "What is your position on healthcare policy?" They ask, "How do you justify your opposition to affordable health care for working families?" The second version embeds several assumptions: that the person opposes health care, that their opposition is unjustified, that their position harms working families without establishing any of these claims as facts. The technique becomes especially powerful when the assumptions embedded in questions reflect popular beliefs or common concerns. Why haven't you been more transparent about this issue? Assumes lack of transparency without proving it exists, but it taps into general public concerns about honesty and openness. Even if the assumption is false, challenging it can make someone appear secretive or defensive. Legal proceedings provide structured examples of loaded question deployment and defense. Attorneys learn to object to questions that assume facts not in evidence, but in less formal settings. People rarely receive training in recognizing and responding to loaded questions. The assumptions slip by unchallenged and become part of the conversation's foundation. But the most insidious applications involve loaded questions that seem to offer generous interpretations or benefit of the doubt. I'm sure you didn't intend to mislead people, but can you explain how this miscommunication occurred? The question appears sympathetic while embedding the assumption that misleading communication definitely happened. The false generosity makes challenging the premise seem ungracious and defensive. Digital communications and social media have made loaded questions both more common and more viral. Headlines that pose loaded questions: "Is this the worst policy decision in decades?" don't have to provide answers. The question format seems objective while actually making strong claims. Readers often absorb the embedded assumptions without noticing the manipulation. The psychology works because humans are conditioned to answer questions rather than challenge them. From childhood, we learn that questions deserve responses, that refusing to answer seems rude or evasive. This social conditioning makes us vulnerable to questions that trap us within false premises or force us to defend positions we never took. The loaded question reveals something troubling about modern discourse: how easily the act of questioning can become a form of accusation, how assumptions can be smuggled into conversations disguised as innocent curiosity. When questions stop seeking information and start imposing conclusions, dialogue becomes manipulation. And when manipulation has been disguised as inquiry, when assumptions have been embedded in seemingly neutral questions, the mind becomes vulnerable to arguments that seem reasonable but rest on the absence of evidence rather than its presence. Appeal to ignorance. The late-night radio show crackles with energy as the host leans into the microphone. "They can't explain the lights people have been seeing over the desert," he declares. "Military officials say they don't know what these objects are. Scientists admit they have no conventional explanation. If our best experts can't tell us what's happening, doesn't that prove these are extraterrestrial visitors? The absence of explanation is itself the explanation we've been looking for." This is appeal to ignorance, arguing that something must be true because it hasn't been proven false, or must be false because it hasn't been proven true. It works because humans are uncomfortable with uncertainty and tend to fill knowledge gaps with conclusions that feel satisfying, even when those conclusions aren't supported by evidence. The technique exploits a fundamental misunderstanding about how knowledge works. The absence of an explanation doesn't constitute evidence for any particular alternative explanation. Unknown lights in the sky might be experimental military aircraft, atmospheric phenomena, equipment malfunctions, optical illusions, or any number of conventional causes that haven't been identified yet. The fact that we don't know what something is doesn't mean we should accept dramatic explanations without evidence. Master practitioners understand that appeal to ignorance works best when the unknown phenomenon is genuinely puzzling and emotionally compelling. People want answers to mysteries, and when conventional explanations aren't immediately available, they become receptive to unconventional ones. The gap in knowledge creates space for speculation to masquerade as logical conclusion. Watch how this operates in business and investment contexts. A new technology company claims their revolutionary approach will transform entire industries. When pressed for evidence, they point to the lack of studies showing their approach won't work. No one has proven our method is ineffective, they argue, as if the absence of disproof constitutes proof of success. Investors facing uncertainty about new technologies sometimes accept this logic rather than demanding positive evidence of effectiveness. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with shifting the burden of proof. Instead of providing evidence for their claims, practitioners challenge others to disprove them. Show me evidence that our supplement doesn't work, they demand, knowing that proving a negative is often impossible or impractical. The inability to provide definitive disproof gets treated as validation of the original claim. Conspiracy theories thrive on appeal to ignorance logic. Government secrecy about certain programs becomes evidence that those programs must involve something nefarious. The inability to fully explain complex events gets interpreted as proof that official explanations are false. Gaps in public knowledge create space for speculation to flourish without requiring actual evidence. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating artificial ignorance, deliberately withholding information or refusing to conduct research that might provide actual answers. A company facing questions about product safety might avoid conducting studies that could reveal problems, then argue that the absence of definitive evidence of harm proves their product is safe. The ignorance is manufactured to support predetermined conclusions. The psychology works because uncertainty creates anxiety that people are motivated to resolve. When faced with unknowns, we prefer incorrect answers to no answers at all. The appeal to ignorance offers the comfort of conclusion without the burden of proof. It transforms the absence of knowledge into the presence of certainty. The technique reveals something troubling about human cognition, our tendency to treat ignorance as evidence rather than as a call for further investigation. We often prefer elaborate explanations for unknown phenomena to the simpler acknowledgement that we don't yet understand what's happening. And when ignorance becomes confused with evidence, when lack of disproof becomes proof of truth, the mind becomes susceptible to arguments that seem wise but actually resist the very investigation that might reveal better answers. Appeal to tradition. The boardroom discussion grows heated as younger executives push for digital transformation initiatives. Finally, the senior partner raises his hand for silence. This firm has been successful for over a century using proven methods, he declares. We've survived 2 world wars, multiple recessions, and countless market changes by sticking to the principles that built this organization. Why would we abandon time-tested approaches for unproven technologies that might be passing fads? Our traditions aren't obstacles to success. They are the foundation of our success. The argument carries weight. Longevity does suggest some validity. Organizations and practices that survive for generations must have something valuable to offer. But does age automatically confer wisdom? Is persistence always evidence of effectiveness? The senior partner's logic conflates survival with optimality, tradition with truth, the past with the future. This is appeal to tradition, arguing that something is correct or beneficial simply because it has been practiced for a long time. It works because humans naturally respect the accumulated wisdom of previous generations and fear the uncertainty that comes with change. Traditions feel safe, tested, validated by time itself. The technique doesn't require false claims about historical practices. Most traditions do have some historical basis and may have been effective in their original contexts. The manipulation lies in assuming that past effectiveness guarantees present relevance, that historical success predicts future performance, that traditional methods are automatically superior to innovative alternatives. Master practitioners understand that appeal to tradition works best when combined with fear of change and respect for authority. They don't just argue that old ways are good, they suggest that new ways are dangerous, untested, likely to lead to disaster. The traditional approach becomes not just preferable but necessary for avoiding catastrophic mistakes. Watch how this operates in healthcare and wellness industries. Alternative medicine practitioners often emphasize the ancient origins of their treatments. This herbal remedy has been used for thousands of years by traditional healers. The longevity is presented as evidence of effectiveness, but historical use doesn't constitute scientific validation. Many traditional practices were based on incorrect understanding of human biology and have been superseded by more effective modern treatments. The technique becomes especially powerful when it taps into cultural identity and group belonging. Traditions aren't just practices, they're symbols of continuity, community, and shared values. Challenging traditional approaches can feel like attacking the group's identity, making rational evaluation of effectiveness secondary to emotional loyalty to heritage. Educational institutions often rely on appeal to tradition to resist pedagogical innovations. We've been teaching this way for decades, and producing successful graduates becomes an argument against educational research that suggests more effective methods. The tradition of lecture-based learning persists not because it's optimal, but because it's familiar and institutionally entrenched. But the most sophisticated applications involve selective appeal to tradition, emphasizing historical practices that support current goals while ignoring traditional approaches that contradict them. A political movement might invoke traditional values while actually promoting policies that would have been radical in previous generations. The appeal to tradition becomes a marketing tool rather than a genuine commitment to historical practices. The psychology works because tradition provides psychological anchors in an uncertain world. Change requires effort, involves risk, and often produces unexpected results. Traditional approaches feel predictable and safe because they've been tested by time. The familiarity of tradition reduces anxiety about unknown outcomes. The appeal reveals something important about human nature, our tendency to mistake the familiar for the optimal, the historical for the ideal. We often assume that if something has existed for a long time, it must exist for good reasons. But sometimes traditions persist not because they're effective, but simply because they're established. And when tradition becomes conflated with wisdom, when age becomes confused with accuracy, the mind becomes vulnerable to the opposite error, assuming that newer must automatically be better. Appeal to novelty. The startup's presentation sparkles with buzzwords: cutting-edge algorithms, revolutionary blockchain integration, next-generation artificial intelligence solutions. The founders emphasize that their approach is completely new, unlike anything currently available in the market. Traditional methods are outdated, established competitors are stuck in the past, and conventional wisdom is being disrupted by innovation. The newness itself becomes the primary selling point, as if recent development automatically guarantees superior performance. This is appeal to novelty, the assumption that newer things are automatically better, more advanced, or more desirable than older alternatives. It works because humans associate innovation with progress and improvement. We're naturally drawn to the latest developments, assuming that each iteration represents advancement over what came before. The technique doesn't require proof that new approaches actually work better than established ones. The novelty itself becomes the evidence of superiority. Latest research, breakthrough technology, revolutionary approach. These phrases carry implicit promises of improvement without requiring demonstration of actual benefits. Master practitioners understand that appeal to novelty works especially well in technology-driven environments where rapid change is normal and staying current feels essential for survival. They position their offerings not just as alternatives to existing solutions, but as inevitable next steps in technological evolution that early adopters can embrace while laggards fall behind. Watch how this operates in software and technology markets. New platforms promise to replace legacy systems with modern architectures and state-of-the-art interfaces. The age of existing systems becomes evidence of their inadequacy, regardless of their actual performance, reliability, or user satisfaction. Companies feel pressure to upgrade, not because their current systems are failing, but because they're no longer the newest available options. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with fear of obsolescence. The implication is that those who don't adopt new approaches will be left behind, that their competitors are already moving to newer solutions, that resistance to innovation is actually resistance to progress itself. The new approach becomes not just better, but necessary for remaining competitive. Fashion and consumer goods industries have perfected appeal to novelty marketing. Each season brings new collections, latest styles, and current trends that make previous purchases seem outdated. The products may not be functionally superior to what they replace, but the novelty creates psychological pressure to update, refresh, and stay current with evolving aesthetic standards. But the most insidious applications involve using novelty to avoid scrutiny of actual performance. A new diet program emphasizes its breakthrough approach and latest nutritional science without providing evidence that it produces better results than established weight loss methods. The novelty becomes a substitute for proof, allowing marketing to focus on innovation rather than effectiveness. The psychology works because humans are naturally curious about new developments and optimistic about future possibilities. We want to believe that progress is constant, that researchers are continuously finding better ways to solve problems, that tomorrow's solutions will be superior to today's approaches. This optimism makes us receptive to claims that newer automatically means better. The appeal reveals something important about modern consumer culture, our conflation of change with improvement, of innovation with advancement. We often assume that the latest version must represent progress over previous iterations, even when newer technologies may be less reliable, more complex, or simply different rather than better. And when novelty becomes synonymous with quality, when the latest becomes confused with the greatest, decision-making shifts from evidence-based evaluation to timeline-based preference until faced with arguments that seem rational but actually rest on emotional fears about unwanted outcomes. Appeal to consequences. The climate scientist presents her research, decades of temperature data, atmospheric measurements, ice core samples, and computer models, all pointing toward the same conclusion about global warming. The businessman in the back row raises his hand. "Dr. Williams," he says, "if your predictions are correct, it would mean completely restructuring our economy, eliminating millions of jobs, and fundamentally changing our way of life. Are you really asking us to accept such catastrophic social and economic consequences? Surely the science must be wrong if the implications are so devastating." The scientist pauses, recognizing the logical trap. The businessman isn't challenging her data, her methodology, or her conclusions based on evidence. He's rejecting her findings because he finds the implications unacceptable. The truth or falsehood of climate change has nothing to do with whether addressing it would be economically difficult, but human psychology makes unpleasant truths easier to reject than comfortable falsehoods. This is appeal to consequences, arguing that something must be false because accepting it would lead to undesirable outcomes, or must be true because rejecting it would have negative results. It works because humans naturally prefer beliefs that make them feel secure, optimistic, and in control, rather than beliefs that create anxiety, demand sacrifice, or threaten cherished assumptions about how the world works. The technique exploits the psychological tendency to confuse what we want to be true with what actually is true. When faced with information that would require difficult changes, costly adaptations, or uncomfortable acknowledgments, people become motivated to find reasons to dismiss that information regardless of its accuracy. The appeal to consequences provides a seemingly rational justification for this motivated reasoning. Master practitioners understand that this appeal works best when the consequences feel personal and immediate rather than abstract and distant. Global statistics about policy impacts may seem theoretical, but individual stories about job losses, community disruption, or lifestyle changes create emotional pressure to reject inconvenient truths. The consequences don't need to be certain, they just need to be scary enough to motivate avoidance. Watch how this operates in medical contexts. A patient receives a diagnosis that would require significant lifestyle changes, diet modification, exercise routines, medication schedules, regular monitoring. Instead of evaluating the accuracy of the diagnosis based on symptoms and test results, they focus on how difficult treatment would be. If this diagnosis is correct, I'd have to give up everything I enjoy. The doctor must be wrong, or at least exaggerating the severity of my condition. The technique becomes especially powerful in political and social policy debates. Opposition to new regulations isn't based on evidence about their necessity or effectiveness, but on projections of their economic costs or social disruptions. If we implement these safety standards, it will bankrupt small businesses becomes an argument against the standards themselves, regardless of whether they would actually prevent injuries or save lives. Insurance and financial planning industries encounter appeal to consequences regularly. People avoid purchasing adequate coverage not because they dispute the risks, but because acknowledging those risks would require spending money they'd prefer to use elsewhere. Estate planning gets postponed, not because people don't understand mortality, but because confronting it feels morbid and depressing. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating artificial consequences that make reasonable positions seem untenable. A debate about educational curriculum gets framed as a choice between academic rigor and student mental health, as if caring about both simultaneously were impossible. The false dilemma makes any position seem to have unacceptable consequences. The psychology works because humans are fundamentally motivated to maintain psychological comfort and avoid cognitive dissonance. When reality conflicts with preferences, it's often easier to question reality than to change preferences. The appeal to consequences provides a mechanism for this reality avoidance that feels rational rather than emotional. The appeal reveals something troubling about human cognition, our tendency to evaluate the truth of claims based on their implications rather than their evidence. We often decide what we want to believe and then look for justifications rather than examining evidence and accepting whatever conclusions it supports. And when truth becomes subordinated to comfort, when evidence must compete with preference, the mind becomes vulnerable to presentations that seem balanced, but actually distort reality by treating unequal things as equivalent. False balance. The evening news anchor introduces the segment with practiced neutrality. Tonight we examine the debate over water fluoridation. With us are Dr. Sarah Chen, a public health researcher who has studied fluoride's effects on dental health for 15 years, and Mark Thompson, a concerned parent who questions whether adding chemicals to our water supply is safe for children. Let's hear both perspectives on this controversial issue. The format suggests equivalence, but is there really a debate? Dr. Chen represents the overwhelming consensus of dental and public health professionals, supported by decades of research involving millions of people. Mark Thompson represents genuine parental concern, but lacks specialized knowledge in toxicology, epidemiology, or dental public health. Yet the presentation implies that both viewpoints deserve equal consideration, that the controversy reflects genuine scientific uncertainty rather than the conflict between expertise and anxiety. This is false balance, the journalistic practice of presenting opposing viewpoints as equally valid when they're supported by vastly different amounts of evidence or expertise. It works because audiences value fairness and expect journalists to present multiple sides of important issues. The appearance of balanced coverage feels objective and responsible, even when it misleads viewers about the actual state of knowledge or expert consensus. The technique doesn't require journalists to explicitly state that all viewpoints are equally credible. The structural elements of the coverage, equal time, similar treatment, equivalent platform, communicate equivalence implicitly. Viewers naturally assume that if two people are given similar prominence in a news segment, their positions must have similar legitimacy. Master practitioners of false balance understand that it can be used to create artificial controversy around settled questions, climate change, vaccine safety, evolution topics where scientific consensus is strong but public understanding is weak, become debates through the simple act of presenting fringe opinions alongside mainstream science. The false balance makes viewers think scientists are more divided than they actually are. Watch how this operates in political coverage. A candidate with extensive policy experience and detailed proposals gets equivalent treatment to one with minimal qualifications and vague promises. The balanced presentation suggests that both are equally prepared for office, that voters face a genuine choice between comparable alternatives rather than dramatically different levels of competence and preparation. The technique becomes especially problematic when it involves issues of factual accuracy rather than subjective opinion. A discussion about historical events might present a historian's evidence-based account alongside a conspiracy theorist's speculation, as if both interpretations were equally valid. The false balance transforms questions of fact into matters of opinion. Corporate public relations campaigns often exploit journalistic commitment to balance. When facing negative coverage about product safety, environmental impact, or business practices, companies can generate false balance by producing their own experts, studies, or spokespeople to present alternative perspectives. Even if their evidence is weak, the journalistic norm of presenting multiple viewpoints ensures their position receives coverage. But the most insidious applications involve using false balance to prevent action on urgent problems. By suggesting that expert consensus is actually ongoing debate, false balance can delay responses to crises, confuse public understanding of established facts, and provide cover for those who benefit from maintaining the status quo. The appearance of uncertainty justifies inaction even when certainty actually exists. The psychology works because people prefer to feel informed rather than to actually be informed, and false balance feels educational. Viewers think they're getting comprehensive coverage when they're actually receiving distorted impressions of how much genuine disagreement exists among qualified experts. The balanced presentation satisfies the desire for thorough journalism while actually undermining public understanding. The false balance reveals something troubling about modern information environments, how the appearance of fairness can become more important than the pursuit of accuracy. When journalistic norms designed to prevent bias instead create new forms of distortion, the public becomes less informed despite consuming more information. And when false balance has created the illusion of equivalent viewpoints, when expertise becomes just another opinion, the stage is set for the final manipulation in our journey through the dark corridors of psychological influence. Cognitive dissonance creation. You've always considered yourself an environmentally conscious person. You recycle, you use reusable bags, you try to reduce waste. Then someone shows you data about your daily coffee habit, the single-use cups, the carbon footprint of importing beans, the water usage in coffee production. The numbers are staggering. Your morning ritual, something you never questioned, suddenly feels hypocritical. The discomfort is immediate and intense. You either need to change your behavior or change your beliefs about yourself. This internal tension is cognitive dissonance, the psychological discomfort that arises when our actions contradict our beliefs, when our values conflict with our choices, when our self-image clashes with our behavior. The discomfort is so powerful that we're motivated to resolve it quickly, often by changing whichever element feels easier to modify. Master manipulators don't just point out existing cognitive dissonance, they create it strategically. They help you recognize contradictions in your thinking, inconsistencies in your behavior, gaps between your stated values and your actual choices. Then, at the moment when that discomfort peaks, they offer a solution that resolves the tension in their favor. Watch how this operates in sales environments. A financial advisor doesn't just present investment options, they first help you recognize the contradiction between your retirement goals and your current savings rate, between your desire for financial security and your risk-averse investment choices, between your plans for your children's education and your actual education savings. The discomfort of recognizing these gaps makes their comprehensive financial planning service seem not just valuable, but necessary for psychological peace. The technique becomes especially powerful when it taps into identity-based contradictions. You seem like someone who cares about quality, but you're considering the cheapest option. You've always struck me as decisive, but you're hesitating about this opportunity. The dissonance isn't just about choices, it's about whether your actions align with who you believe yourself to be. Political campaigns exploit cognitive dissonance by highlighting contradictions between voters' stated values and their voting patterns, between their desired outcomes and their preferred policies, between their personal experiences and their political loyalties. The discomfort of recognizing these contradictions motivates people to resolve them, often by changing their political positions to align with the new framework they've been presented. Corporate environments use dissonance creation to motivate employee behavior. A manager might help someone recognize the contradiction between their career ambitions and their current performance level, between their desire for respect and their tendency to avoid difficult conversations, between their claims to be team players and their reluctance to take on additional responsibilities. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating dissonance that seems to emerge naturally from self-reflection rather than being imposed by external pressure. I'm curious, how do you reconcile your commitment to innovation with your resistance to this new approach? The question feels like genuine inquiry while actually highlighting a contradiction the person may not have previously recognized. The psychology works because consistency is a fundamental human need. We want our beliefs, values, and actions to align in coherent ways. When someone helps us recognize inconsistencies, we experience psychological pressure to resolve them. The person who created the dissonance often benefits when we choose resolution strategies that favor their interests. Yet cognitive dissonance creation reveals something profound about human psychology, how much our sense of self depends on internal coherence, and how willing we are to change our thoughts or behaviors when that coherence is threatened. The technique works because it harnesses our own psychological need for consistency as a tool for external influence. But sometimes the most powerful psychological pressure comes not from highlighting what we're doing wrong, but from challenging our very desire to resist being influenced. Psychological reactance reversal. Your teenager's room is a disaster. Clothes everywhere, dishes growing mysterious substances, homework buried under layers of chaos. You've tried everything: nagging, bargaining, threatening consequences. Nothing works. Then you try something different. You casually mention that you've realized expecting a perfectly clean room from someone their age is probably unrealistic. Maybe messy rooms are just part of being a teenager. You're going to stop worrying about it. Within a week, their room is cleaner than it's been in months. This is psychological reactance reversal, using people's natural resistance to being controlled as a tool for influence. It works because humans have an innate drive for autonomy and freedom. When we feel pressured to do something, even something we might otherwise want to do, we often resist simply to maintain our sense of independence and control. The technique operates by appearing to remove pressure while actually increasing it through reverse psychology. By suggesting that someone shouldn't or can't do something, you trigger their desire to prove that they can and will. By indicating that you don't expect certain behavior, you make that behavior more appealing as a way for them to exceed your expectations and demonstrate their capability. Master practitioners understand that psychological reactance reversal must feel authentic, not manipulative. The person must genuinely believe that the pressure has been removed, that they're free to choose without external influence. If they suspect reverse psychology, the technique backfires and actually increases their resistance to the desired behavior. Watch how this operates in professional relationships. A manager stops micromanaging an underperforming employee and instead expresses confidence in their ability to handle responsibilities independently. The removal of oversight often triggers improved performance as the employee works to justify the trust that's been placed in them. The absence of control becomes more motivating than the presence of supervision. The technique becomes especially powerful with people who have strong needs for autonomy and independence. High achievers, creative personalities, and natural leaders often respond more positively to apparent freedom than to direct instruction. By framing requests as suggestions, expectations as possibilities, and requirements as optional choices, skilled influencers can motivate compliance while allowing targets to feel they're acting from their own initiative. Marketing often employs reactance reversal through exclusive or members-only positioning. By suggesting that a product or service isn't for everyone, that many people wouldn't qualify or wouldn't be interested, marketers trigger desire to prove membership in the select group that can and would want access. The artificial exclusion creates artificial demand. Dating provides perhaps the clearest examples of reactance reversal in action. The person who seems slightly disinterested, who doesn't pursue aggressively, who maintains mysterious unavailability, often generates more intense attraction than someone who is obviously eager and available. The lack of pressure creates space for the other person's own interest to develop naturally. But the most sophisticated applications involve creating environments where the desired behavior feels like rebellion against external constraints rather than compliance with your requests. A teacher who suggests that advanced material might be too challenging for her students often finds them more motivated to tackle difficult concepts than if she simply assigned the work directly. The psychology works because autonomy is a fundamental human need. When people feel their freedom is being restricted, they experience reactance, a motivation to restore their sense of control by acting in ways that oppose the restriction. Skilled manipulators use this reactance as fuel for the behaviors they actually want to encourage. The technique reveals something important about influence and resistance. Sometimes the most effective way to motivate someone to do something is to give them permission not to do it. The removal of external pressure creates space for internal motivation to emerge, and internal motivation is often stronger and more sustainable than external compliance. Yet psychological reactance reversal can be dangerous when used unethically because it exploits people's healthy desire for autonomy while still manipulating their behavior. The person feels free while actually being influenced, which can create the worst of both worlds: manipulation without awareness, control without consent. And when autonomy has been carefully managed and resistance has been redirected, the stage is set for one of the most disorienting forms of psychological manipulation: the deliberate disruption of expected patterns. Pattern interruption. The handshake should have been routine. Grip, shake, release, continue conversation. Instead, the man holds your hand slightly longer than expected, then uses his other hand to briefly touch your elbow while making eye contact and saying, "It's genuinely good to meet you." The moment is subtle but jarring. Your brain, expecting a standard social ritual, instead encounters something unexpected. In that brief moment of confusion, while your mind adjusts to the pattern break, other psychological processes slip past your normal defenses. This is pattern interruption, the deliberate disruption of expected behavioral sequences to create moments of heightened suggestibility. It works because human minds operate largely on autopilot, following familiar scripts for common social situations. When those scripts are suddenly interrupted, we experience brief periods of uncertainty where we're more receptive to external guidance about what should happen next. The technique exploits the fact that most human behavior follows predictable patterns. We have scripts for greetings, for ordering coffee, for ending phone calls, for responding to questions. These mental programs allow us to navigate social situations efficiently without conscious thought. But when the pattern breaks unexpectedly, our conscious mind must engage to figure out what's happening and how to respond appropriately. Master practitioners understand that effective pattern interruption must be subtle enough to create confusion without triggering suspicion or alarm. The break should feel like a minor social irregularity rather than bizarre or threatening behavior. A salesperson might compliment something unexpected, not appearance or clothing which would be standard, but handwriting or the way someone organized their materials. Watch how this operates in therapeutic and coaching contexts. A counselor might respond to a client's familiar complaint with an unexpected question that breaks the usual pattern of discussion. Instead of offering sympathy or advice as the client expects, they might ask something completely tangential. What color would you associate with that feeling? The pattern break disrupts the client's habitual ways of thinking about their problems and creates openings for new perspectives. The technique becomes especially powerful when combined with immediate suggestion or direction. While the person's mind is still adjusting to the unexpected pattern, the practitioner provides clear guidance about what should happen next. Since we're both clearly committed to finding the best solution, let's focus on implementation details rather than getting bogged down in more analysis. Digital environments have created new opportunities for pattern interruption. Expected website navigation gets disrupted by pop-ups, unexpected interactive elements, or design choices that break users' mental models of how sites should function. The brief confusion creates moments where users are more likely to follow suggested actions rather than pursuing their original intentions. But the most sophisticated applications involve interrupting not just behavioral patterns, but thought patterns. A negotiator might suddenly shift from discussing terms to asking personal questions, breaking the expected flow of business conversation and creating a more intimate, trusting atmosphere. The pattern break makes whatever follows feel more personal and significant. The psychology works because pattern interruption temporarily suspends our normal critical thinking processes. When familiar routines are disrupted, our brains must work harder to make sense of what's happening, which reduces the mental resources available for skepticism and analysis. In those moments of confusion, we become more susceptible to suggestion and direction. The technique reveals something important about human consciousness, how much of our mental activity operates below awareness, following scripts and patterns we rarely examine. When those patterns are disrupted, we glimpse the automatic nature of most human behavior and the periods of heightened suggestibility that exist in the gaps between one script and the next. And when patterns have been interrupted and consciousness has been temporarily destabilized, the mind becomes especially receptive to influence from those who seem to exist outside the normal social frameworks entirely. The outsider's advantage. The consultant enters the conference room, and immediately you sense something different. They're not trying to fit in, not attempting to mirror the corporate culture or speak the internal language that everyone else uses instinctively. Instead, they observe with quiet detachment, ask questions that insiders would never think to pose, challenge assumptions that have become invisible to people inside the system. Their outsider status, rather than being a disadvantage, becomes their greatest source of credibility and influence. This is the outsider's advantage, the psychological authority that comes from existing outside established systems, relationships, and assumptions. It works because people inside any group or organization develop blind spots, shared biases, and collective ways of thinking that can prevent them from seeing problems clearly or imagining alternative solutions. The technique doesn't require genuine expertise or superior knowledge. The outsider's power comes not from knowing more, but from seeing differently. They're not invested in current approaches, not committed to existing relationships, not constrained by internal politics or historical precedents. Their perspective feels fresh, objective, uncompromised by the factors that influence insiders' judgment. Master practitioners of outsider advantage understand that they must balance detachment with engagement. Too much distance, and they seem irrelevant or out of touch. Too much integration, and they lose the objectivity that makes their perspective valuable. The sweet spot involves demonstrating understanding of the insider's world while maintaining the independence that allows for unconventional insights. Watch how this operates in organizational consulting. External advisors often receive more attention and credibility than internal employees who might have better ideas and deeper understanding of company operations. The outsider's recommendations carry weight precisely because they come from someone without skin in the game, someone who can speak uncomfortable truths without worrying about office politics or career consequences. The technique becomes especially powerful when the outsider's perspective confirms suspicions that insiders have been afraid to voice. They give permission to acknowledge problems that everyone has noticed, but no one has been willing to discuss openly. Their external status provides cover for conversations that would be politically dangerous if initiated by someone within the organization. Religious and spiritual contexts often grant outsiders special authority. A visiting teacher, a traveling monk, a consultant from another tradition can say things that local leaders cannot, challenge established practices that insiders feel obligated to defend, offer perspectives that feel revelatory precisely because they come from outside the familiar framework. But the most sophisticated applications involve cultivating outsider status even when you're technically part of the group. This requires maintaining psychological distance from internal politics, avoiding commitment to existing approaches, and positioning yourself as someone who serves the organization's interests rather than any particular faction within it. The psychology works because outsiders seem less likely to have hidden agendas or conflicting loyalties. Their motivations appear clearer. Their perspectives seem less corrupted by self-interest. People trust them to provide honest assessments precisely because they don't have to live with the long-term consequences of their recommendations. Political outsiders often leverage this psychological advantage to challenge established candidates and traditional approaches. Their lack of experience in government becomes evidence of their independence from corrupt systems. Their unfamiliarity with political norms becomes proof of their authenticity and commitment to real change. But the technique can be dangerous when outsider status is used to avoid accountability for poor advice or unrealistic recommendations. Someone who doesn't have to implement their suggestions or live with their consequences can propose radical changes without fully understanding their implications. The outsider's advantage can become the insider's nightmare when detached perspectives lead to impractical or harmful decisions. The outsider advantage reveals something profound about human psychology, our tendency to devalue perspectives we encounter regularly while overvaluing those that feel rare or unique. We often listen more carefully to strangers than to friends, to consultants than to colleagues, to anyone who seems to exist outside our normal sphere of influence. The technique works because it exploits our assumption that objectivity requires distance, that truth becomes visible only from outside the systems we're embedded within. But sometimes the most valuable insights come from deep understanding rather than detached observation, from commitment rather than independence. And when outsider status has been established, when distance has been converted into credibility, the mind becomes vulnerable to influence precisely because it feels safe from manipulation. You've seen how influence works at its sharpest edge, how small cues, layered emotions, and crafted contrasts can make almost anyone agree without ever knowing why. These aren't tricks outside of us, they're forces built into the way every mind works, waiting to be directed by those who understand them. If this exploration gave you something to think about, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or giving this video a like. Each gesture helps us continue uncovering the hidden machinery of psychology and persuasion. And most of all, thank you for being here.